Aloha mai kako. Good morning to everyone. Actually, good afternoon or good evening, depending upon where you are tuning in from. Welcome to the LSMPA Managers Summit 2021, presented by Big Ocean, and also a big thanks to the Blue Nature Alliance and the Ocean Foundation who have supported this work. So we're going to get started. Just because it's virtual and trying to respect everybody's time, we're just going to move forward. It's recorded. So, if you at some point need to leave or come back, just know that you'll be able to watch at least the full plenary sessions post summit. So my name is Naya Lewis. I'm the coordinator for Big Ocean, and I'm your host for the summit. For those of you who don't know me, I am the network coordinator, and I've held this role since the inception of Big Ocean in 2010. The story of the network is an important one. I'm just going to ask you guys to keep your mics turned off until we give you a heads up otherwise. So I've been the coordinator since 2010, and the story of the network is an important one, but for the summit, we're actually going to focus on the genre of large-scale marine management as a whole and that story. However, I do want to honor the genealogy of Big Ocean and thank all of the managers and founding sites, plus our friends and colleagues across marine conservation for their commitment to Big Ocean. I also want to thank Aulani Wilhelm, whose mind came up with this crazy idea for the network while she was superintendent at Papahanaumokuakea. And in turn, I'd love to really thank the staff at the monument, especially, all of my friends that were literally there during those first 5 or 6 years that were really hard to bring Big Ocean up to speed. So for all of you who are here online today, thank you so much for being here and presenting. But first, in the longstanding tradition of Big Ocean, we're going to open our meeting with protocol. And to help us to be intentional today, I am pleased to introduce Kalani Kiocho. He's the Pacific Islands Regional Cultural Resources Coordinator for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. I worked with Kalani when he started at Papahanaumokuakea, plus he's been on Big Ocean's planning team for several years. I'm really grateful for his participation, and I've enjoyed supporting his efforts, for our inaugural kind of regathering here in 2021. So Kalani is going to do an opening oli, and then I think he's going to actually have a component where you guys can clap along and participate. And this is all just to help you guys invest more deeply in today's outcomes. So please welcome Kalani.
E kanaloa nui a kia e kanaloa hauna vela kanaloa kia la ma'awe ula kala ka ni kia la ula kala kanaloa noho i ka moana nui mo ana iki mo ana o i kai anui kai aiki ka mano i ka niui ke kohola hohonu o ke kai hohonua he'e o ke kai hulia palaua o ke kai kia honu o ka hou ka iloloa o la ke kinu hale o hamna vela o nau walua kanaloa i paa i ka maka walua kanaloa o la. Lana i ke kai, lana i ka honua, lana i ka houpoa, kanaloa i ka moku papaka kia kua olono. Olono ka pau ola i ke awa kanaloa i. Aloha mai kako, greetings everyone. Thank you so much, Nai'a, and to all of you for welcoming me into this space. My name is Kalani Kiocho. I come from Hawaii and I have the privilege of sharing these oral traditions with you today. Puka mai kala I kumukahi is a mele kaholo. It's a traveling song of sorts. It was written and composed by my predecessor, Keoni Kuoha, with the assistance of his partner, Pueo Pata. Puka mai kala I kumukahi was created so that all managers of Papahanaumokuakea could have access to other ways of knowing and being. And it is one of the many things that has allowed us to undergo this arduous and privileged journey together while navigating and fulfilling the rights and responsibilities for caring for this place and making sure that it is proper for Hawaii and all of the world. Pukamai begins in the east on the island of Hawaii at Kumukahi, where the first source of light bursts forth and reveals itself casting westward, setting at Lehua Island, the edge of our dwellings. And we reached the beloved waters of Nihoa. We voyaged in the wind across long, well-traveled paths of our ancestors until everything joins together at Holaniku, the westernmost moku in Hawaii. This mele, this song, includes clapping, so feel free to clap. It is meant to set us in motion. We will perform it 3 times to continue this journey together. When we are ready, we'll begin, and mahalo so much for being present. Pukamai kalai kumukahi laea velo wanai lehu alaea iwai aloha kamakani laea o Hawaii loa ke ala hula laea ihola ni keku ina ihola niku. Pukamai kalai kumukahi laea velo wanai lehu alaea iwai aloha kamakani laea o Hawaii loa ke ala hula laea ihola ni keku ina ihola niku. Pukamai kalai kumukahi laea velo wanai lehu alaea iwai aloha kamakani laea o Hawaii loa ke ala hula laea ihola ni keku ina ihola niku. Mahalo and aloha to you all.
Unmute myself. I'll remember that. Mahalo Piha Kalani for joining us today. Everyone, he's actually going to provide a protocol again tomorrow, and then he will continue on with a short presentation that gives you more information about how Papahana Mokuake has incorporated culture into their management and showcase the recently released cultural plan called Mai Kapo Mai. So for today's agenda, again, you can grab that from the chat. It actually has a few small tweaks. So for all of you who have run events, you know that there's always changes until the last moment. They're not very big, but again, we've added a few additional hyperlinks to allow you to access more information about our presenters or some of the materials that they're talking about in their presentations. So today, the overall theme is where is the field? And the objective of today is to understand broadly the status of LSMPA management or marine management at scale, the status of sites. And we're going to be asking each one of you to think about where you fall in this landscape, right? We're going to work to build a picture and then ask you to see where you orient yourself within this landscape. We want you on both days to begin building relationships and expanding your network, as well as strengthening the existing relationships that you have. We're going to be sharing part 1 of our survey outcomes, and the breakout session will be questions provided to you that relate to our first presentation that will be brought to you by Rebecca Gruby. I'm going to kick us off with an opening presentation. It's the Big Ocean perspective on the history of large-scale marine management. And then today, we only have one breakout session, but for all of them on both today and tomorrow, just know that each time you guys will be in a different group of 6 or 8 people. And in order to build relationships, we would like you guys to spend the first 10 minutes just getting to know one another. And we've given you guys in a note-taking form that we will share an icebreaker question for each session. We also have one 5-minute bio break. And remember, again, like Momi said, to take breaks when you can. And for our Ignite talks, our dear friends and colleagues are going to be providing, in fairly quick succession, 5 to 6 minute presentations on their particular topic area. So we're not adhering strictly to the Ignite Talk format, but these are short, punchy presentations. And then if you guys could hold your questions, kind of note them to yourself. After that, at the end of the day, we will be having kind of a group plenary Q&A for both the Ignites as well as any other questions that you guys would like to ask for today. So I think on with the show. I'm going to turn my video off here, and my team is going to present, or actually they're going to drop into the chat links to the script that I'm reading from. So we will include the English, even though you aren't really going to need that. It has the hyperlinks, but we're also going to provide a version in Spanish and French. I know that still might be difficult kind of reading or watching in real time, but we're trying to be helpful. And I guess I would like to say, I'm sorry we can't present the entire summit in 3 different languages, but we're doing our best to be inclusive. So I'm going to stop my video here. The ocean is a global system essential to all life on our planet. The ocean covers approximately 70% of the Earth's surface and is 99% of the volume that is inhabitable to life. It produces 50 to 80% of the oxygen we breathe. It absorbs greenhouse gases that can keep climate change in check, and it determines weather patterns and temperatures. The ocean also serves as highways for seaborne international trade, provides livelihoods for 3 billion people, and supplies them with 15 to 20% of their protein. It also produces almost 2.5 trillion each year in goods and services, which in gross domestic product terms would make the ocean the 7th largest economy in the world. We need the ocean. Its health is our health. We are the ocean. In recognition of the ocean's importance, nations of the world have created conservation targets on behalf of humanity's future on multiple occasions. One of the best examples is the Aichi targets, where in 2010, 193 signatories of the Convention on Biological Diversity gathered in Nagoya, Japan at the Conference of the Parties to hammer out 20 ambitious conservation goals to safeguard global diversity. For coastal and marine areas, this was 10% by 2020. Unfortunately, we failed to meet these targets, but there is a silver lining. In trying to achieve these global goals, we've learned a great deal. Science now tells us that we need to protect at least 30% of the ocean to support life on Earth into the future. The post-2020 framework of the convention now includes the target of protecting at least 30% of marine habitat by 2030. Additionally, in June 2021, G7 leaders agreed to a historic nature compact at the summit in Cornwall, United Kingdom. The compact is the most wide-ranging and ambitious set of coordinated conservation actions by G7 countries to date. The 30% protection goal of land and ocean is front and center. G7 countries have also committed to lead by example by protecting 30% of their national lands and waters. So what is 30% of our global ocean? And how do we achieve a 3 times higher target? The answer is complex and includes more sectors than just conservation. So it might be better to ask a different question. What can large-scale MPAs or the LSMPA community of practice contribute towards global goals? First, we leverage resources and research across these Sentinel sites to understand better and more effectively address global environmental threats. Fully or highly protected MPAs of all sizes and scales have the greatest chance of achieving biodiversity conservation, food provisioning, and climate mitigation. However, large-scale MPAs offer benefits that are not achievable at smaller scales, primarily the ability to protect whole ecosystems and interdependent habitats within the same management area. Second, we can prioritize best practice standards and further professionalize the field to ensure we implement equitable and effective management. As we scale up our protection measures, we must also go big with our values. We must continue to learn and share what enabling conditions are necessary for successful management outcomes that extend beyond our sites. To lessen negative impacts on people and communities and vital sources of intergenerational knowledge. Third, we can grow our pilina, or our relationships, because this community, our community of LSMPA managers, practitioners, and partners are, as we say in Hawaii, kamaka o ka'ihe, we are the tip of the spear. Even though there are thousands of MPAs globally, close to 17,000 of all sizes, scales, and levels of implementation and protection, 73% of current global marine protection comes from the 41 established and implemented LSMPAs greater than 100,000 square kilometers. That means all member sites of Big Ocean, plus other sites shown on this map, and a few that aren't. That means most of the participants in this summit can directly affect and catalyze the impacts of scale on marine conservation globally. To better understand where we are going, we must start by looking at where we have been. As Big Ocean leads with Pilina, the network sees its strengths and values as interconnected as the interconnections between people and place. Passing on critical stories of these relationships is vital, and this is why Big Ocean works to document and share the history, genealogy of LSMPAs broadly and individual sites. As we develop our sail plan into the next decade, we must understand our origins in order to reach our destination together. So what is the story of large-scale marine management and protection? The short version, the very, very short version, goes something like this. In 1975, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park was created. However, it wasn't established as a marine protected area in the way that we think about them today. Instead, the park's origins lie in the Western world's social uprisings of the 1960s, when activist-led environmentalism joined with political activism. There was also a recommendation from the First World Conference on National Parks held in Seattle in 1962 that urged countries with coastal boundaries to prioritize the establishment of MPAs. The combination of these and other factors opened the door to making this historic conservation achievement a reality. With threats increasing near the Great Barrier Reef, including tourism, agriculture, and oil drilling, concerned citizens championed a Save the Reef campaign in 1967. The group used what we would now call a really well-designed media strategy that presented the Great Barrier Reef as a precious ecosystem at risk from exploitation. Fast forward a few years, and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act passed in 1975. Unfortunately, the world would not replicate Australia's innovative actions for another 25 years until establishing a second vast marine managed area. On December 4th, 2000, US President William Clinton established the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Coral Reef Ecosystem Reserve. He called it a bold and visionary action. However, it was also the first fully remote large-scale MPA. The reserve continues to exist as a political entity today, but is overlaid by Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, established in 2006. Despite the decades-long lag between the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and Papahānaumokuākea, the establishment of these two globally relevant sites meant that ocean protection could be catalyzed in a new way, and it was. Early adopters of the large-scale model set the foundation for a new genre of ocean protection to proliferate. From the point Big Ocean was launched in 2010, the scaling up of marine conservation has been happening at an ever-increasing pace. And the early chronology of sites is as follows. In 2008, soon after Papahānaumokuākea, the Phoenix Islands Protected Area was established. Then in 2009, the Marianas Trench and Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monuments became official. Motumotito Hiva Marine Park and the British Indian Ocean Territory MPA followed suit. In 2012, the Australian government once again went big with ocean protection and established a network of marine reserves. The majority of these sites aren't large scale, but over time, at least 5 sites have come to fit this definition, including the Coral Sea Marine Park, which in 2012 was the premier large-scale MPA to be established. In 2013, 14, and 15, South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, the Natural Park of the Coral Sea, and Palau National Marine Sanctuary were established. And then between 2016 and 2021, the remaining large-scale MPAs that you can find on a map today were established, including the largest MPA globally, Marae Moana, which encompasses the entire EEZ of the Cook Islands. During this time, the United States also expanded two of its sites, the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument in 2014 and Papahanaumokuakea in 2018, which increased in size by almost 4 times, going from approximately 362,000 square kilometers to 1.15 million square kilometers. So now that you have Big Ocean's perspective on the genre's origins, let's share a few successes and challenges in the context of individual sites. The lessons from on-the-ground managers are vital to understanding that management is truly a journey. Although the Great Barrier Reef was an unprecedented approach globally to managing natural resources at the time, it took decades for the park to have the look and feel of what we consider to be a well-designed MPA today. For example, it was not until July 2004 that the Australian government increased protection from extractive activities, such as fishing, from 4.6 to 33.3%. Also, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people maintain a connection to their land and sea country, despite historical events of dispossession and displacement. As a result, the Park Authority has consistently increased resources to support these people and communities to assert their right through active engagement, policy, and planning programs. Papahanaumokuakea is often described as the premier MPA for the United States, especially as legal protection measures started as early as 1903, when President Roosevelt wanted to stop the slaughter of seabirds for feathers and eggs on Midway Atoll. Still, the marine protected area itself is a reality because of a small, passionate group of Native Hawaiian fishermen like Uncle Buzzy Agard, who catalyzed interest in preserving the near pristine ecosystems of the most remote 3/4 of the Hawaiian archipelago. Similar to the Great Barrier Reef, managing agencies have pioneered the integration of traditional knowledge into management. For example, the Reserve Advisory Council's Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group reviews permits, has supported the development of a cultural research plan, and provides leadership for a nomenclature committee that names or renames species using the Hawaiian language and cultural perspectives specific to naming. More recently, established sites have equally unique stories that feature community champions, passionate practitioners, and trailblazing scientists who went the extra mile to protect vital marine resources. Marae Moana, for example, is a reality because of people like Jackie Evans and Kevin Ito. They dedicated several years to traveling from community to community to ensure that as many people as possible had the information necessary to understand the marine park's purpose and vision. However, with great success often comes a significant challenge. Conflicts can arise when science, community, and academia clash, or when boundary and zoning proposals suggest fundamental changes to regulations that would impact cultural access or how nations might choose to utilize their marine resources in the future. One example is establishing Motumotuilohiva Marine Park and Rapa Nui Multiple Use MPA. The overarching context of protecting these nested sites is the long-standing struggle of the indigenous people of Rapa Nui in disputes over territory with Chile and a prior history of top-down conservation that often lacks transparency, accountable decision-making, and participatory processes. However, through partnerships with research institutions, NGOs, and the Chilean Navy, as well as foundational support from government institutions, the region has made significant advances in marine protection. In parallel, traditional ownership and cultural practices and perspectives have been recognized. Considerable investment has been made to increase the management and research capacity within the community, and more specifically, the next generation of Rapa Nui. And in this next slide, I'm really, really pleased to be able to present it. It's actually from a site update presented by our dear friend Carlos Gamer for Motumotuilohiva, presented at Big Ocean's 2012 network meeting in Jeju, Korea. And the message on this slide from their managers is as relevant today as it was almost a decade ago. As stories of inequity, injustice, and the impacts of colonialism are not rare within conservation broadly, It is the responsibility of all practitioners committed to best practice to ensure that poorly designed processes and management regimes that are not supported nor implemented. Further, it's essential to share critical lessons learned so that new sites can be created and managed in ways that prevent or at least mitigate costly mistakes and community trauma. In addition to the unique stories of individual sites, some management challenges apply to the genre as a whole. For example, the creation of LSMPAs is mainly through national legislation, so all sites face the uncertainties that come with a change in political administration, from budget cuts and changes in regulations to a loss of champions and a need to re-educate agency partners. The politics of large-scale marine conservation can be tricky, even for the most seasoned managers and practitioners. And we can't forget the importance of effectively managing public sentiment and stakeholder support. Poorly used data, misinformation, biased news stories, or influential stakeholders with a questionable agenda can sway or worse, manipulate people and communities. Management teams must have media and communications capacity internally or through trusted partners. There was a time in the early days when it was challenging to counter provocative narratives because so little was known about LSMPAs, even within marine conservation itself. Despite significant growth of the field, plus publishing papers, articles, and even Big Ocean and IUCN's global LSMPA guidelines in 2017, a wide variety of misconceptions about the genre remain. From large scale, always equaling paper park, to MPA only meaning no take, or that top-down governance is always bad, there are a few course corrections that still need to be made. Therefore, as we navigate into the next decade, it is essential to design new outreach strategies that consider a broader set of perspectives and include messaging that addresses the human dimensions of marine management at scale. As the summit is meant to help us understand better our shared story by talking with each other, I'm going to stop here. The hope is that this presentation has created a baseline that you can all build upon in your breakout groups and in our plenary sessions. Big Ocean asks each of you to listen and share with an open heart and mind. Seek to grow your pilina, or the relationships you have and will make through this summit. Consider orbiting a bit closer to our network, join the community of practice, or engage with individual sites and management teams that work on the ground each day to fulfill their missions. Going big with marine protection isn't easy, but it is critical to creating a healthy ocean and a sustainable future for humanity. On behalf of Big Ocean, I would like to extend a heartfelt mahalo. Thank you to our longstanding partners and the Blue Nature Alliance for supporting the summit. The investment of your collective time, resources, and experience is priceless. Okay, you guys, thank you. I know that presentation was a little bit longer than normal, and we threw a lot of information at you, but I hope that was helpful. One of the things that I would like to say right now, because this applies overall, is if everybody could kind of keep a fluid idea of what large is, at least in terms of what's being presented, and not really get hung up in like the exact numbers. So as an example, Big Ocean really focuses on marine management. So when we say large scale MPA, it's probably only between 32 and 34 sites, that are currently legally established that might fit that as well. We've usually run off 150,000 square kilometers as the base. And if you look at the MPA Atlas, they have 100,000 square kilometers. Like below that is large, and then above that is very large. So between Big Ocean's definition and the current online databases, there's not 100% consensus. With that said, I think at the scales that we're talking, right, the focus here today is really best practice management. And I think we can focus on that without, getting hung up on the exact number of sites. So that would be great. Okay, very cool. Papahana Mokwake is here. Motumotiro Hiva, Nasca Desventuradas, Chile Jackie, Marai Moana. Oh, yes, manager in recovery. And Palau, awesome. Hey, King, nice to see you. Okay, so we actually have a pretty good representation of sites. Our next presentation is going to be part 1 of our survey outcomes. And thank you to everybody who took the survey. What I want to say here is one of our goals would definitely be to be able to get at least 1 or 2, really seasoned practitioners at every single LSMPA globally to take this survey at some point. That would be awesome, since we have it translated into Spanish and French. With that said, I want to bring up Rebecca Gruby. She has worked with Big Ocean multiple times, including the survey for the summit at our 2016 think tank with human dimensions of LSMPAs. In addition, Rebecca is assistant professor in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department at Colorado State. And for more information about her, you can click on the links in the agenda. So welcome, Rebecca. I'm going to step back.
Thank you, Naya. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to see some familiar faces, or names, I should say, and many that I haven't met yet. So as Naya said, I'm Rebecca Gruby. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State, and been working on issues related to the human dimensions of natural resources since 2014. And I'm so pleased to have had the opportunity to partner with Big Ocean on this survey that we conducted to assess management progress and key priorities for large-scale marine protected area management. And I'm going to be presenting the results of that survey today. And before I move forward, a quick couple of acknowledgements are in order. First, I just want to mention that I designed this survey and analyzed results together with Noella Gray, who is an associate professor at the University of Guelph. John Day, Nia Lewis, and Lisa Campbell provided valuable feedback on the draft survey to ensure that the information we collected would support our discussions and our work as a community of practice. The Blue Nature Alliance and the Ocean Foundation supported this work. And most importantly, we thank the participants who took the time to complete the survey. So I'm sure some of you are here today, and we send a heartfelt thanks to you all for taking the time to do the survey. So we conducted the survey for a couple of reasons. First, we wanted to assess the state of large-scale MPA management. And I'm just going to say LSMPA from here on out. You all know that acronym well at this point. As we all know, managing at scale comes with unique challenges and opportunities. And while there have been several global assessments of MPA management, these have not focused on LSMPA as a distinct category. And so we wanted to take the pulse on large-scale MPA implementation, specifically in terms of both progress and needs. Secondly, we wanted to help identify priorities for the LSMPA community of practice. And third, we wanted to help identify priorities and opportunities for the Big Ocean Network, specifically in supporting and advocating for its members. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on this first objective, the state of LSMPA management. And I'll share the survey results, and then we'll all have an opportunity to discuss them and digest them in small breakout groups. And the goal for this session is really to build a shared understanding of the state of the field across sites. In presentations tomorrow, Naya and Noella Gray will share survey results related to the second and third objectives, so stay tuned. So first, a couple of points about the survey itself. The first thing to note is there was actually 2 surveys, and they were complementary. One was a longer survey that asked detailed questions about specific sites. And so we asked people who work at particular sites or have detailed knowledge of particular sites to complete this survey. And 18 people completed this survey from 11 different sites. Those respondents were mainly associated with the government sector. We had a second, shorter survey that then asked questions about LSMPAs more generally. And we asked people who are familiar with the field, but who don't have as detailed site-specific knowledge to take that survey. And so 12 people completed that, what we're calling the general survey, with reference to 7 different sites. and respondents were primarily associated with NGOs for that survey. So in total, we had 30 responses representing 15 different LSMPA sites. And while this doesn't sound like a large number, this is also not a very large community. And so we think this actually represents a significant number of people who have knowledge about LSMPA management, and it includes about half of the LSMPAs globally. Surveys were done in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and French. So here's a list of the 15 sites that respondents from both of those surveys were most familiar with. And so this includes the site-specific survey and that more general one. And so when I discuss results in the presentation, I'm going to refer either to how answers varied across sites or across respondents, depending on the type of question. And I'll always make this clear. I also want to emphasize that the data that we're presenting here reflects the perceptions of survey respondents. For some sites, multiple people who were knowledgeable about that site actually took the survey. Sometimes those people responded in the same way to the questions, and sometimes their responses differed. So when I share information about sites or at the site level, I am reporting the number of sites where at least one respondent familiar with that site indicated the corresponding response. And so this gives us a good understanding of the spread of responses to the questions. And I'm going to be focusing the presentation today on results from that site-specific survey. So respondents from the survey that I'm going to be talking about today were familiar with the 11 sites that you see here. But I do want to mention that answers from the general survey were generally quite consistent with the results that you're going to hear today. Okay, so what did we find? I'm going to talk about the results in relation to the 9 topics that we explored in the survey. The first topic focuses on the state of regulations, management structure, and management plans. So when we asked respondents how they would describe regulations at the site, most people said that LSMPA regulations are established and they are clear, but they said that those regulations are not always well understood. And this was a particular concern for 2 types of regulations: those regarding access and use, and those regarding management bodies, including their roles and responsibilities. At most sites represented in the survey, management included a federal or national agency. In 5 of the 11 sites, the management is solely the responsibility of a government agency, while at 4 of the 11 sites, it is shared with 1 or more other agencies or organizations that you see here, or communities. Management coordination challenges were common across all but 1 of the sites. The most commonly cited challenge was a lack of clarity regarding responsibilities, followed by interagency conflict, and then conflicting legal mandates and conflicts related to funding. Respondents also listed 2 additional challenges under the other category where they were able to write in a response. And they said they experienced issues regarding a lack of clarity on what information should be communicated. And also they experienced cultural differences, including different worldviews, cultural values, and how this translated into management. Less than half of the sites have a current management plan. Okay, so for those sites that do have a current management plan, only 2 of them said that those plans are taking climate change into account well within their plan. Most of the sites that do not have a current management plan, however, are in the process of developing one. So all sites that are currently developing management plans expect that plan to be completed within the next 2 years, so by 2023. Next, I'll turn to results about community involvement in management and trends in social conflict related to LSMPAs. So for the 11 sites that respondents were familiar with in this site-specific survey, 8 of them have formal advisory councils or similar groups, while 3 did not. And most people described those councils as helpful. Respondents also described community members as somewhat or very involved in ongoing decision-making at most of the sites represented in the study. Finally, a large majority of the respondents described the level of social conflict as either absent or just decreasing in recent years across a majority of the sites. Next, I'll review findings related to objectives and outcomes. So large-scale MPAs have multiple objectives, as we all know. And so we asked respondents which kinds of objectives are officially established at their site. And importantly, we asked them which ones were actively prioritized in management. So not surprisingly, all of the sites actively prioritize the protection or conservation of natural heritage and biodiversity and important habitats. Most of the sites, 7 out of the 11, also actively prioritize cultural heritage. Fewer than half of the sites prioritize sustainable production or income generation. And in addition, one site identified sustainable tourism as an explicit objective. Respondents described the majority of sites as either highly or fully protected, which means that either no or only lightly extractive activities are allowed. One site was described as lightly protected, and one site was described as minimally protected, where moderate to significant extraction or other impacts are allowed. We also asked respondents to consider how their site is progressing towards meeting those management objectives. And so the big takeaway here is that a majority of respondents across a majority of the sites said that either there was some progress being made toward each of the applicable objectives, although slower than expected, or that the site was on track to meeting most of their objectives on the intended timeline. There aren't major differences in progress being made across the different types of objectives, although relatively fewer sites are on track to meeting their cultural management objectives compared to their socioeconomic and biophysical management objectives. But given that many sites have been established fairly recently, it's not that surprising that objectives have largely not been achieved yet at the field level. So assessing whether objectives have been met and how to meet them requires monitoring and adaptive management, which I'm going to turn to next. So we found that monitoring deficiencies are very common. First, we found that there is no monitoring for cultural or socioeconomic issues in about half of the sites. Second, we found that the use of monitoring results for adaptive management is uncommon in general. And when it does happen, it's done most often for biophysical objectives. And finally, we've also found that all sites reported relying on scientific or Western knowledge for their monitoring, and respondents from 6 sites are also reporting engaging local knowledge and/or Indigenous knowledge and worldviews in their monitoring programs. Underlying any discussion of monitoring and progress towards objectives is a consideration, of course, of budgets. And so we asked respondents several questions relating to budgets at their sites. We asked people to characterize the management budget at their site relative to the current management needs in 3 different categories. First, operational budgets, so things like fuel or supplies or rent. Second, staff salary. And third, capital and infrastructure, so things like boats or equipment or buildings. And so the major finding, which is unlikely to be surprising to many of you, is that all respondents said that sites are underfunded relative to their needs. Nobody reported that the available budget is sufficient to meet management needs in any budget category. About half of the sites represented in the survey, 5 out of 11, are severely underfunded, either reporting no dedicated budget or a budget that is inadequate to fulfill basic management functions across all budget categories. 2 other points that are worth noting is, first, there was no one budget category that was significantly more or less well-funded across the sites. And secondly, respondents at all sites had some degree of concern about the stability of their budgets, ranging from slightly concerned to very concerned. And it was the sites that lacked a dedicated budget currently who were more concerned than others, which suggests there may not be other sources or obvious sources of funding on the horizon for those sites. The importance of non-governmental sources of funding is variable across the site, but it was often quite important. So it's notable that for respondents at 7 sites, more than half in the study, non-governmental sources of funding are equally or more important than government sources. A large majority of respondents also reported that the current funding for their site is less or much less than what was promised or expected at the time their site was designated. And so to summarize, budget and funding challenges are quite significant and they're pervasive. Next, we asked respondents to describe the capacity of staff at their sites. And here, staff refers to people whose jobs are all or partially dedicated to supporting LSMPA management. So we found that staff capacity is another significant challenge for sites. No sites reported that staff capacity is adequate for all their management needs. Respondents associated with most of the sites in the study, 8 out of the 11, reported that either there is no staff assigned to support their site or that staff capacity is inadequate for critical management functions. Capacity gaps existed across all positions and skills that we asked about, including scientific, IT, community outreach, enforcement, administration, and other positions. And again, we found that external organizations are important for filling in staff capacity gaps at most of the sites in 7 out of the 11. So as we all know, another significant challenge for LSMPAs is in surveillance and enforcement. And so here we found that respondents from most of the sites, 8 out of the 11, reported serious deficiencies in surveillance and enforcement capacity. And given this finding, it is perhaps not surprising that most respondents also said that major and minor violations of the LSMPA rules and regulations are rarely or never prosecuted. So why is this? Respondents identified several barriers and challenges to effective enforcement and surveillance. The 3 most commonly cited reasons, and these were cited by about 60% of the respondents, were insufficient budget to pay for surveillance and enforcement, a lack of staff, and a lack of necessary equipment. Other challenges that respondents identified include a lack of surveillance technology, a lack of political will to prosecute those who violate the rules, and interagency relationships and compliance coordination and challenges related to those. Another area that the survey asked about was equity. And equitable management is called for in Aichi Target 11, the one that Naya referred to in her presentation, and is an increasing area of focus in protected area management. And equity can refer to fairness in the distribution of positive and negative impacts among groups, respect for the rights and knowledge of all groups in management, and inclusiveness in decision-making processes, etc. Many other considerations. Respondents indicated that equitable management is a priority for most sites. Nobody said that it wasn't a priority, although 4 people weren't sure. When asked to what extent the rights and knowledge of Indigenous peoples and locals communities were respected in site management, most respondents said that they are recognized fully or to some extent, as shown in this graph. Where the question was applicable and where respondents held relevant knowledge, respondents across most sites also felt that the costs and benefits associated with LSMPAs were distributed fairly or somewhat fairly. So a final topic that we asked about in the survey was about political support. We asked respondents how they would describe the current level of support for the site among high-level government officials as a measure of political support. And the responses are shown here. As you can see, respondents from most of the sites reported moderate to high support among relevant high-level government officials. Most commonly, across both respondents and sites, The capacity of the management team to develop and maintain political relationships was also rated as acceptable or good, as shown in this chart. And so there might be a relationship among political support and the capacity of the management team to develop and maintain those relationships. Everybody who reported moderate to high political support for their site indicated that the capacity of the management team to develop and maintain those political relationships was acceptable to very good. And everyone who reported low to very low political support also indicated that that capacity among the management team to maintain those political relationships needs improvement. So to sum up, while many of these survey results may not have been surprising to you, our goal was to better document these issues and build knowledge about what is happening across the broader field beyond particular LSMPA sites. And so we found that there are many common challenges, including budget constraints, staff capacity constraints, limitations of surveillance and enforcement, and insufficient monitoring. And perhaps the LSMPA community of practice can come together to strategize and manage these challenges. But the results also highlighted some shared bright spots that the community can celebrate, right? Many of the sites are still relatively young, so the fact that management plans are either in place or under development at most sites is a good sign. And the perception that conflict is decreasing and that management is largely equitable is another positive result worth noting. Findings related to political support and progress towards management objectives were also promising. However, while the shared challenges and accomplishments can provide starting points for collective learning and discussion, there is still significant variation across the sites for many important aspects of management. And these differences can also provide excellent learning and discussion opportunities. And of course, these survey results are not comprehensive, right? So whether these findings apply more broadly to the field as a whole beyond the 11 sites that are represented in the survey findings is a whole other important topic for discussion that I think we can have during this summit. And so those discussions are going to begin right now. So in our first breakout session, we'll be giving you some time to digest and discuss these results in smaller groups. And we're going to encourage you to think about what surprised you most about these results, which of the results resonate most with your experiences, which findings are you most concerned or excited about, and what is your role? Where do you think you can make the most impact? So thank you so much again to those of you who participated in the survey, and thanks to the rest of you for your time and attention. I'm going to hand the floor back to Naya, who is going to give us some more detail on the breakout groups.
Thank you so much, again, for just supporting the survey from the very beginning. We have a few minutes. I see a question. If anyone else has like a really specific question about the survey, I think we can take one. I'm just going to throw this out there. Rebecca, you let me know if you feel you can answer this based on the survey. Progress toward achieving objectives seems contradictory to the challenge of budget and capacity constraints. Do you think this means that budget capacity is actually more sufficient than perceived?
That's a great question. I noticed that too, Naya. And I think it's important though to note how many folks said that progress was slower than expected. And that might be consistent with the budget constraints. And so I think that's something we can talk about during the summit, and it's something worth exploring further. But I certainly can't answer that question myself.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to give you guys some instructions for breakouts. In the meantime, we are going to be, downloading the chat at the end. So as you guys have questions, if you feel, like free, I don't know if it allows you to like ask them anonymously here. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Obviously, we will have the Q&A at the end of the day. But any really critical questions that we don't get to across the summit, we will work to answer and provide those to you guys at the end. Building upon what Rebecca said, though, I think a part of the goal of today is to also normalize that it's okay to say not fully funded, or it's okay to have shortcomings. I'd like to really tie back to the part of the presentation to just remind everybody that, right, 73% of the oceans protected are by these large scale sites. And so I don't think it's a matter of deciding anymore whether they're good enough to remain a legitimate tool. They are a tool, and we just have to employ them as best we can with best practice management, because there's such a significant impact to marine conservation as a whole. So I'm hoping that we can normalize being able to say that we're all in progress. Let me check the chat one more time.
There was a great question. Somebody said, I won't call the person out. Somebody sent me in the direct message that I think is worth just responding to.
Yes.
They asked how we think these responses might have been influenced by the pandemic, like progress towards meeting management objectives, community involvement, et cetera. Perhaps this would have been higher under different circumstances, or is likely to change in the future once things start to open up. I think that's an excellent point. And one of our interests in this survey is that it can serve as a baseline that could potentially, be built on in future years. So what if we do the survey again in 2 years? What if we do it again 2 years after that? We can actually track progress and change over time. And so without doing that, I don't think we can answer that question because we don't know what has happened up until now in this similar fashion. So I think it's worth systematically tracking progress over time as we seek to understand how contextual things in the world affect and shape progress towards meeting LSMPA goals. It's a really great question. Thanks for that.
No, thank you, Rebecca. And again, so that's where I'd like to underscore. We'll figure out a way to, I guess, more formally do this, but if you guys have contacts for anyone who is a manager who could speak for that site globally. Again, we have the current survey in 3 different languages. We would actually like to, launch an effort to really get a comprehensive set of data and have as many sites as possible present. And then I think what Rebecca said, once we have all of those contacts, then doing a second and third survey, right, where we can even, if a staff member leaves, we have the ability to connect with another person and really track a complete data set would be really powerful. Okay, again, I can't take another question here. We're gonna really try to stay on time. So we're gonna send you guys to your breakout rooms. The questions that Rebecca had on her last slide are the questions that you guys are gonna be talking about. With that said, my team just dropped in a note-taking sheet into the chat. If everyone could click on that, and when you do, please don't use it as a Google form. I mean, you can, but then everyone will be writing each other's notes over the same document. It would be very ineffective. So if you guys click on that and actually download it, there's instructions there. And ultimately, you can use it as your own note-taking form, but we would like one person to be the note taker for each group. And these will be randomly selected groups of between 6 and 8 people. And then at the end of the day, the instructions are even there. You can click on the hyperlink for the email and just send in the notes. And to underscore, it's in the instructions, but these are high level notes, right? The core takeaways of what your group was talking about. We definitely don't want anybody feeling like they need to rapporteur in these sessions at all. So we're gonna send you out into breakouts here, and then we will bring you back. So the first 10 minutes are for you guys to relationship build and then go from there. The breakout rooms will automatically give you like a little warning before they whisk you back into the main room. So the questions again are on the note-taking form. You'll start with the first breakout, but I'll read them quickly again. What surprised you most about these results? Which of these results resonates most with your experience? Which findings are you most concerned or excited about? And what do you feel your role is, or where you can make the most important impact? But again, these are conversations for your group. So if you guys, find that your energy is going somewhere else based on the mix of your group, go for it. Okay, so Jonah is going to send us into breakout rooms, and we will see you guys back here. we are going to actually set up for some report backs here so that we can all hear from you guys. I think we're running a little behind time, but not too bad. So let's see, my group, can you guys give me a text of if we had 6 or 7 rooms? If we could just have a report back, kind of just the high level takeaways from your groups, that would be really great. I believe our group was number 1. Rebecca, am I putting you on the spot? Can you report back for our group?
Yeah, no problem. We had a really interesting discussion around funding. I don't think anybody was particularly surprised about the findings around funding, but the discussion was around how LSMPA managers can leverage the lack of funding in a way as an opportunity to be more creative and innovative and build partnerships. And so it was a very sort of forward-looking, optimistic discussion around, how to operate even in an absence of a lack of complete funding. There were many other threads to the conversation. There was a lot of interest in continuing to talk with one another as a community of practice and share experiences and build continuing partnerships. That was sort of the thread that we left off on. I would love to invite others from the group to chime in with key points that I'm missing. If that's okay, Naya.
Yeah, I'll go first. If anyone from our group wants to come up, but I think at least my comment was, how can we also normalize that it's okay to not be fully funded? It's okay to not have, it's not an argument anymore about whether we should have or not have large scale sites. It's about, at least to me, how do we create best practice management? How do we grow that? How do we support sites on this management journey to get from where they are to where they would like to be? And that, like, not fully funded does not have to be this really bad thing. It's like, how do we drill down though and understand what is being funded, what is successful, where, if the funding is limited, should it go? This one of our questions was, if certain sites got the money tomorrow, what would that first step be? And that might be a more interesting answer, right, than just, is it funded or not? So anyone from group 1 in our group, if you guys want to say anything, please do.
Yeah, I'll just add in. Kia ora, everyone. Chanel here. For those of you that haven't met, I'm waving to them. Yeah, I think that's an accurate reflection of the conversation we had. It was really great to come away from that and everyone still wanting to talk. And we were still talking. Naya left us quickly. As soon as that little thing came on, she clicked out and the rest of us stayed there and talked. So we felt a little bit like, oh, she doesn't want to be with us anymore. But that wasn't the case. She's a very busy lady. So we stayed on talking and we were, we were really getting excited because, that funding thing is a constraint, but it's also, it resonated for me because I'm concerned about it, but excited because the opportunities it presents. It does allow us to be a lot more innovative in how we're looking at funding, the partnerships that we're able to create in it. And also it enables us to be a lot more sustainable in our approaches with those partnerships, with how we have to go about it, and the co-creation of certain aspects of a management plan and how you will be relating to any sort of funding mechanism that you're going to bring into that. One of the other things that we raised and what I had noted was that education and that citizen science and citizen engagement part had not been brought up in the survey results, which I think is a key part in this. So I just raised that and talked about a little bit about that and having citizens more engaged in the management process in that. So I just wanted to add that and happy to give it over to my cool group.
Thank you, guys. I know also equity. I think that was a really good one. We brought up that having equity in the survey was great. That can be talked about a lot, but it's not always a direct ask. but I think it's probably good for group number 1. We can actually just go in order unless groups want to jump forward. So group 2, or we could go the other direction, group 6.
I'm happy to go for group 2 and then open it to the other people. Okay, so our group, I think what's most interesting about it is how we talked about the relationship between some of the findings, which raised questions for us. So for example, the finding about reduced levels of conflict and how that relates to things like progress or political support or capacity building and funding. So for example, we heard about how conflict has been reduced through things like the adoption of advisory councils and more grassroots processes, but concern that lack of funding could really undermine those efforts. And those are efforts that were kind of implemented to overcome some of the initial conflict. So the concern about like lack of funding is a big category, and sort of lack of funding for what? And retaining things like community advisory councils and the mechanisms that people felt had contribute to conflict resolution was one of those things. Also, that conflict resolution and running advisory councils require certain sets of skills. So even thinking about capacity building is like capacity building to do what, and feeling like that managing community advisory councils and expectations require both resources and skills. We talked a little bit about how high-level political support has been so important to these sites in getting them up and running and established, but are also often a source of conflict because they often come through top-down processes. So some of the thoughts about conflict changing over time are, sort of the initial politics of top-down establishment have been, mediated or overcome through time. We also talked about like the possibilities that conflict is reduced because benefits are realized, or alternatively, conflict is reduced because people's fears about what these spaces will do don't materialize because of lack of enforcement and capacity to enforce. So, we just saw lots of interesting relationships between the results that we talked about. Yeah, and that's probably the biggest, like the broadest types of ideas we discussed. We talked a little bit about roles, but yeah, I would just stop there and open it up if there's anyone else in our group that wants to jump in.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, is anyone else from that group? Thank you. I love that insight on relationships. How about group 3 if we're just going in order?
Naya is group 3, the group I was in. I'm sorry, I don't know my group number. This is Scott.
All right, Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
Is that, I don't know if that's a group number, but I'll go for our group, whichever number it was.
Yeah.
Okay, we had Ellie, Kate, Patrick, Katie, Carlos, and myself. And I think I got everybody. If I missed anybody, I'm very sorry. Okay, alternative careers real quickly so you get to know us. Ellie would be a writer or a poet. Kate, own a bakery. Patrick, a union organizer. Katie, do small scale tourism operation. Carlos, marine ecology, and Scott would be a zookeeper. Okay,
that was, you guys are, that's competing with our group. I appreciate you sharing that. Actually, we had a really good fun conversation for that icebreaker. So that was great.
And my group, did I miss anybody? Because my Zoom is, and well, I'm defective. I don't know if my Zoom is, but I didn't miss anybody. Speak now if I did. Okay, thank you. All right, so we had one manager and a few academics and a few practitioners. Basically not surprised by the results. We thought the group thought, and everybody on the group, please chime in, I'll try to keep this brief. We thought that one of the most important things that resonated with us that we're having this conversation, the survey is a great start, but there are probably lots of differences across countries, of course. So digging in deeper, disaggregating it was one of the things that was suggested. We said that the definition of success is a question for a lot of people. A lot of people look at it very differently. So, you know, what is sufficient budget for one person may not be for the others. We were surprised by the fact that the issue of equity scored so high that it was being addressed. And we wondered if that might be because what is the definition of adequacy related to equity? It could be that you're complying with government requirements, or, you know, some people may define it much more completely and fully than that. So that was a surprise to us, and it's something that we were concerned about and thought we should dig in more. You know, are the indigenous people or original people of the places really fully represented, as the survey kind of indicated that there was a good bit of equity. Let's see, something that resonated was the lack of staffing and budget resonates, particularly with Kate, who's our one manager who was with us. And she said that, you know, even though she has a staff and a government funding, it's not adequate in her opinion. And there are so many sites that don't have that necessarily. So it's going to always be a struggle. Let's see, the dependency on NGOs and government. This was something that resonated, that there is a dependency, but also with some of these innovative conservation finance mechanisms coming out, that is something that we can look to that might change the level of dependency on those original sources. And we didn't get to roles, but the big take home for our group, I think, was it was really exciting to have the conversation. There's always more than you can do in just a short breakout, but any other of the group members, please add if I missed anything.
Thank you, Scott. And Scott, you guys are group 5, just to let you know.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had no idea. I couldn't see the timer or the number, but sorry, group 3. Yeah. You're now group 5, so.
So we had 6 groups total. That's been, so half of us have reported back. I'm just kind of weighing the, you know, being on time versus letting everybody talk. How about for the last 3 groups? I mean, it would be great to hear from everybody. Are there elements of, like, from your groups of things that haven't been mentioned, or maybe like a unique perspective or some other key takeaways that groups 3, 4, or 6 would love to share? I definitely want to hear a little bit from everyone. Hey, Jackie. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure which group we're in, which group number, but yeah, I guess most of our discussion was about, you know, we had some comments on the questionnaire itself, but also we found one of the main points, there are 2 main points really through our discussions, and one was how well partnerships have helped. And we used the example of the NOAA Oceanus Explorer research vessel for deep ocean research when it moved through the Cook Islands on its way to American Samoa. From American Samoa. Well, it actually did a couple of loops. But it was passing through US territories, and normally only surveys in US territories. And because we're on the way, it just made sense to, you know, do a bit of deep sea mapping and observations within our Marae Moana as well. And even though it was for a short period, it was very impactful because of the ability for school children in the Cook Islands at the remotest atolls. These are kids in school in very remote atolls to the north, you know, miles away from everywhere. Being able to watch in real time what it looks like in the deep sea, including, as well as politicians, you know, our Prime Minister watched, and a few of the other high-level government heads of ministries and members of the public were able to see that the deep ocean is actually alive with, you know, biodiversity. It's not just all mud and sand. So these sorts of partnerships, like with the Schmidt Oceanographic Institute's vessel as well, going from Australia to Kiribati, they're just so helpful, even though there was, you know, very little, you know, it wasn't a huge stretch, you know, to be able to share those resources with us. It was just a matter of being aware that we're there and coordinating, which, you know, we're so grateful for. So the other point that we talked about at length was the budget issue. So we talked a lot about the Chilean marine protected areas, you know, where the research budget was very limited, and you know, it's not just in the biophysical sphere, but also in the sociocultural sphere, and you know, dealing with different cultures. So I guess basically it relates, you know, to what was said previously. But one other good point was that we need to empower the people in those communities to speak up, and also to empower them legally to address issues. If anybody else has something to add from our group, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, if anyone else from her group, and so if Jackie's gone, that's probably two other groups. And just for future reference, I think when you guys are in the breakout rooms, if you look down like at the bottom, there's this little thing that says breakout, and there should be a little like circle and a number, I think, that lets you know what room you're in, but not a problem. We can keep on moving. So can the last two groups?
Naya, I can speak for group.
All right.
For group X.
Yes, group X.
Group X plus one.
Yes.
So yeah, I think, you know, the thing the thing that surprised us, we talked a bit about the responses around folks feeling like they were on track to meet objectives, which was you know, very positive, and that was a little bit surprising, particularly related to the responses around financing, which were not surprising at all, but clearly sort of moving in opposite directions in a way. But we really got talking about a comment related to the legal establishment being clear but not well understood, I think was the response. And that led us into a broad conversation around the challenges regarding communications and stakeholder engagement, and how, you know, the perspectives that we shared were that, you know, practitioners and you know, all of us need to be better about socialization and communication, but we also recognize the magnitude of the challenge, the diversity of the communities and types of stakeholders over time, the repetitive outreach and the changing of those stakeholders over time, and how significant of a challenge that is. And also how what we're actually trying to communicate, the complexity of that, and oftentimes the variety of designations and lines of authority that have purview over these sites, and how challenging it is to communicate these different permutations, and getting the attention of stakeholders, particularly in a time like now when so much focus is clearly on something that is understandably critical in the COVID pandemic and health and livelihoods. And then we came back to highlighting the importance of communication among the network and human connection, and that you know, expressing gratitude for events like this, and looking forward to more events like this in terms of learning and connecting with folks. So I'm sure I missed a lot of other interesting things. So I think Lori has left us, but Alani, Daniela, Stacy, or Annette, if I have anything to add, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate that. I can definitely see that the groups are, whether or not you're, you know, intentionally connecting to Pilina or relationships, as I kind of put that out in the initial presentation, I feel whether it's the relationships between elements of management or the relationships between people, that's definitely something that everyone is hitting upon. So I think it's like one more group X.
I'm guessing that's my group, because I don't.
Yeah, Ginny. Yes, of course it's your group, Ginny. Yes.
I don't know that I'm the designated reporter. So
you are
now. We jumped all around. I think the thing that was surprising to multiple members of our group was the high level of political support across so many sites, particularly given the low level of funding and political support often being reflected in financing for what they support, as well as the fact that there's been a lot of political transition and turnover at the highest levels in a lot of the countries that have large-scale MPAs. So seeing that there's still a high level of political support is actually quite encouraging. I think we also talked quite a bit about the lack of climate change in management plans, and that being a particularly concerning item that we're struggling to deal with, and that transitioned into some conversation about changing priorities, rapidly changing priorities. And I think that actually circles back and relates back to the political commentary earlier on, although we didn't get to that point in the conversation. And happy for anybody else in the group to add to my very quick summary.
No, I appreciate that. I feel like there was a lot of similarities. So if there, we can kind of highlight any of the differences. I appreciate, again, this piece of funding. I feel like it's how do we kind of disconnect that a little bit and drill down and ask a few questions. If the government itself just simply doesn't have the funding, it may support it, right? So your answer to one question and how it relates, again, in the relationship, I think, again, the relationships are just really critical between these two. Okay, so you guys, we are in that part of our agenda, which I've really been looking forward to. This is our Ignite speakers. And again, I just want to remind you guys that in the agenda, we have hyperlinks. So I'm gonna give the names and affiliations of our speakers, but if you guys want in-depth bios, and this is a really interesting bunch, please go ahead and click on those links so that you guys can learn more about each one of them. Our first presenter is Mr. Alan Friedlander, and his topic is science. So again, these Ignite talks, we're not going to adhere formally to the format, which is like 5 minutes and slides that you have to automatically advance. It's high pressure stakes, but each one of these are going to be about 5-minute presentations. And please hold your questions, and then we'll do a big Q&A about both the Ignite talks as well as anything else that you guys want to talk about at the very end. So our first presenter on science at scale is Alan Friedlander. He's the scientist for Nat Geo Pristine Seas and director of the Fisheries Ecology Research Laboratory at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Welcome, Alan.
Okay. Can you guys see my slides?
We can. It's still the.
Yeah. I'll get there.
Yeah, your
okay.
screen.
How about now?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. Aloha, everybody. Aloha. Hola. Iorana. Kiorana. Ali. Anything else I've forgotten? But so I started working in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands several decades ago, before Papahanaumokuakea was created, and was one of the original members of the Northwestern Hawaiian Island Coral Reef Advisory Board. And since that time, I'm working extensively with them and also with many people on this call. So great to see everybody. I'm going to talk about remote last wild places and the science behind that, but I want to acknowledge the fact that many of these places, in fact, all of these places, have strong cultural connections, and they're all peopled in one form or another. So at the end of the day, it's all about managing people, but I'm going to just stick to the science here, but just want to acknowledge the fact that it's about people at the end of the day. So my day job at National Geographic is chief scientist for Pristine Seas. And this project is about saving the last wild places in the ocean through a combination of exploration, media, science, and policy. And since 2008, I've led 30 some expeditions, been to all of these places from pole to pole, every place in between. And we've helped protect 23 areas, over 6.5 million square kilometers. Many of the big ocean sites are represented within this map and within what we've helped to accomplish with Pristine Seas. And so these places have really given us an opportunity to examine what large scale looks like across the globe, across many different types of ecosystems. And so we've learned a lot during that period of time, produced a lot of science, made a lot of documentary films, and helped support the management of a number of these places. And this is Caroline Atoll in Kiribati in the South Pacific. And this kind of epitomizes what remote, large-scale, pristine places look like, dominated by large predators, healthy coral reefs. These are absent in most places around the world. So we really need these places as benchmarks to tell us how our management strategies are doing elsewhere around the world. They really give us a window into the past of what ecosystems look like before extensive human exploitation took place. Because most of these places are remote and difficult to access, we try to throw as many assets at them as possible, because what we want to do is paint a picture of what the entire ecosystem looks like. So conventional shallow water scuba diving, technical rebreather diving, manned submersibles when possible, deep water drop cameras, which have been to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 10,000 meters, the deepest spot on Earth, and every place in between, and also a series of different baited camera systems. So this allows us to paint a picture of what the entire ecosystem looks like and how it all fits together. And this just gives us a better idea of understanding that system and how best to manage it. So one example I want to give in the Seychelles, the Aldabra Group Marine National Park was recently created. It was a debt for nature swap negotiated by the Nature Conservancy and others. And these remote atolls and islands are far removed from the high inhabited islands to the north. And so they give us a really good contrast of what remote versus inhabited and protected look like. And what we see is in the inhabited islands, so places that don't have any protection at all, we have low fish biomass and hardly any predators. So no groupers, no jacks, no snappers. Even in MPAs and fully no-take MPAs within the Seychelles, they fare much better than areas that are not protected, but they pale in comparison to what remote places look like, this remote Aldabra group. So without these remote areas, we wouldn't have this benchmark. We have what's called the shifting baseline. So these remote areas are dominated by predators, jacks and groupers and snappers and sharks, and the no-take areas around the main islands just aren't adequate in conserving those complete ecosystems. Moving on to Juan Fernandez and Desventuradas Marine Park. So biodiversity can be measured in a bunch of different ways. These are some of the most unique islands on Earth. They harbor some of the highest endemism, species found nowhere else on Earth. The endemic Juan Fernandez lobster, the Jesus frontalis, is a sustainable fishery that's been well managed by the people of Juan Fernandez for a very long time. But it's part of this complex, unique group of protected areas that even though they're close to the South American continent, they look nothing like it. So these remote, large-scale protected areas often harbor species found nowhere else on Earth, therefore making them incredibly important for biodiversity and biodiversity conservation. And it's not just about biodiversity hotspots. Let's think about biodiversity cold spots. In the far north Russian Arctic, we helped create the Russian Arctic National Park of Juan Fernandez. The water temperature is -1 to -2 degrees centigrade, yet life thrives in these environments. And iconic species like polar bears and walruses inhabit these areas. So we can't think about just places that have a large number of species, but also places that have important species to those ecosystems. So what are the lessons learned from the last wild places in the ocean? They're dominated by large predators like sharks and jacks and groupers. They also have iconic species like these sperm whales in the Azores or polar bears in the Arctic. They typify these last wild places. Endemic species found nowhere else on Earth, like this banded butterfly fish from the Juan Fernandez and Desventurada Islands here. They also have strong architectural species, whether it's kelp forests, coral reef, seagrass beds. These architectural species form the three-dimensional structure that creates all this unique biodiversity. And finally, they possess intact ecosystems. These intact ecosystems allow these ecosystems to be resilient in the face of climate change. So moving forward, our ecosystems in the past were quite healthy. Today, they are much less so. If we want to get to 30% protection, we need fully and highly protected areas to achieve conservation goals. But we also need to look at OECMs or other areas of conservation, other areas of conservation measures, because it's not only about remote protected areas. We also need to engage people and figure out how to get to 30-30 and beyond, while having healthy ecosystems that are going to support the ecosystem services that we all need, that Naya talked about at the beginning. So mahalo, and I will stop sharing.
Mahalo, Alan. Thank you so much for that. Again, if there are questions, please note them, and we will bring everyone back up for a panel that's both on the Ignites and then other questions you might even have just more broadly. So our next speaker is Noah Greenberg. His area is sustainable financing. Noah is the director at Starling Resources, and he's also a co-author on the Pacific Islands Forum and World Bank publication, Funding Marine Protection at Scale. It was a project that Big Ocean Conservation International and Starling Resources worked on together. And I'm really glad that Noah is joining us today. So Noah, take it away.
Thank you. Give me 1 second here. All right, let me just find one more thing here. There we are. Okay, thank you. This is a challenge, 5 minutes, and I know that most of you know more about this stuff than I do, but let me see if there's anything I can share that might be of use to you. My name is Noah Greenberg. I manage Starling Resources. We are a Indonesian-based consulting group focused on, with a large focus on financing for protected areas and sustainability initiatives. You will note that I titled this Keys to Progress, not Keys to Success. I think we have seen in our earlier conversations how elusive this definition of success can be. And so I think we need to recognize the scale of the challenges and recognize that success is perhaps we need to be realistic about what success is. And so scaling back our expectations sometimes is the best thing we can do to recognize our own success. I also want to complain a little bit about the business planning, the term business planning. We often hear that now when referring to financial planning for conservation and protected areas. I understand that business plans offer a wealth of information, but they also lead to some expectations. And a lot of my job is often working with stakeholders to socialize LSMPAs or MPAs as cost centers and set realistic expectations about what kind of financing can be generated in and around MPAs and LSMPAs. So I prefer to talk about financial planning and management. As Naya mentioned, we helped develop a recent report, Funding Marine Protection at Scale, and I'll just present a few of the real key high-level takeaways, really principles for LSMPA financial planning very quickly here. The first thing is to prioritize financial planning. We often find that folks are quite focused on management planning and a variety of other critical tasks, sometimes don't have the bandwidth for financial planning. But unfortunately, if you put financial planning on the back burner, you will likely get burned by it. So how do we prioritize financial planning? Allocate resources, staff time, budget, get leadership buy-in, ensure that higher level leaders understand the critical importance of financial planning for LSMPAs and MPAs. And secure the appropriate expertise. There is some technical skills required, and oftentimes best to bring that in from the outside. Another way to prioritize financial planning is how to time the activity of financial planning. Again, often folks dig into management planning at an early date, and we often recommend that financial planning should take place alongside management planning, and that these are actually iterative processes. And so financial planning should not only support management planning, but management planning should be designed to fit within financial limitations. This leads us to a critical concept of cost containment. And so management planning should take into consideration the measures that can be deployed to contain costs in order to develop realistic scenarios that can be adequately funded, rather than going back once we have a very ideal scenario and trying to develop funding to fit that. We also talk about integrating financial planning with other processes. Integrating with seascape planning is really critical. This puts the costs associated with an LSMPA in the context of other revenue generation activities, which is really critical. And activities like government budgeting, aligning with government budgeting processes can really increase the likelihood of allocating government budget. So funding sources, diversification of funding sources is critical. If relying on a single source of funding, of course, puts an LSMPA at a high risk. But we also have to recognize that 2 or 3 or even 2 sources of funding is really quite a strong footing, realistically speaking, in what we see in practice these days. There are multiple sources of funding, philanthropic, market mechanisms, and government budget allocations. Really want to highlight government budget allocations. Again, there is a push to search for other sources of funding, and those are critical. But government budget allocations have been, and I predict will remain, the critical source of funding for conservation and for LSMPAs well into the future. And that message needs to be socialized to our government partners. They are the natural stewards of these initiatives, and their role should not be diminished. We also recognize the different timing of some of these sources, so it may be appropriate to bring in philanthropic or donor funding earlier in the process to support planning processes, for example. And finally, I want to mention, I think it was highlighted earlier, the role of in-kind funding, bringing in government partners to play roles that they would normally play and tailoring them slightly, or parlaying those to support conservation initiatives. Oftentimes we see the other side of that process happening, where government entities want to try to push off some of their responsibilities onto conservation initiatives. And so we would try to push back very hard against that and ensure that instead they are playing their natural role in support of conservation initiatives. Consult, communicate, and collaborate. Obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about this in our breakout group, engaging key stakeholders in durable partnerships. So it's not just consultations, but developing these partnerships over time, developing champions among the different stakeholder groups. And really the fundamental lesson is that the financing mechanisms need to be tailored to the site. They need to be tailored to the local resources, the local communities, the local legal context, local capacities. They need to work in that context. And likewise, communications need to work in that context and need to be tailored to the different audiences. And then, finally, developing a network. We talked about this also. Events like this can really be useful for lessons learned and perhaps broader collaborations as well. Finally, operationalizing financial mechanisms. This is a bit of a catch-all, but again, really looking at and developing the capacities, clarifying the procedures, developing the oversight and monitoring systems, and then bringing that back to communications to ensure that everyone understands how things are performing, whether or not goals are being met, and what is being done to address any shortcomings. So with that, I will conclude. Again, just a couple of summarizing some of the key kind of findings. The folks that had some of these things in place when we looked broadly at LSMPAs were the ones that had made the most progress towards effective financing of their LSMPAs. And so with that, I thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Noah. I appreciate your participation in the summit. And again, note your questions. We're going to move to our next speaker, Miss Ashley McGovern. She's going to be speaking on funders and NGO partnerships. Ashley is the Senior Director of Innovation and Development at Conservation International. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, it is lovely to be with everybody. Thank you, Naya, and to the entire community for inviting me to be with you today. I'm honored and I'm feeling like I'm in the unenviable position of following Alan and Noah. Learned a lot from your talks. Thank you so much for sharing. As you said, my name is Ashley McGovern at Conservation International. I work at the intersection of strategic partnerships, philanthropy, and program design. An expression of that work has been building the Blue Nature Alliance, which is supporting Big Ocean very proudly. I'm passionate about creating space for people to come together and creatively solve problems. And as such, I've had a unique opportunity of engaging in this space from both the funder and the nonprofit perspective. So today I'm going to share some data, some trends, and I'll close with a few resources that you can all explore further on your own. So I'd like to begin as I share my screen, so hopefully this works, with a question for all of you. How much money do you think the global funding community invests in ocean conservation each year? Just ballpark when you think about private sources like foundations and even individuals, and public sources like development aid. How much, just to hold in your head each year, how much? Well, thanks to a report by our friends at CEA, we know that according to the latest comprehensive data, it's about $1.2 billion from these two sources. You'll see here in yellow our private philanthropy, which is about half of it, and then the other half comes from development aid. For the purposes of today's conversation, I'm going to focus on the yellow bar, which is more than $600 million of funds by private philanthropy. And now this covers all areas in ocean conservation. And pretty big sum, so let's break it down and see where it goes. First, by geography. Upwards of 80% of investments have focused on North America or cross-cutting science and global priorities. This leaves 20%, or about $120 million, for the rest of the world. So the numbers start to get small rather quickly. When broken down by topic area, we find that about $220 million is allocated to what is referred to as protected areas and habitat protection. Now that's more broad than just marine protected areas. So of that, we find from this year in 2016, about $40 million was committed to advancing marine protected areas around the world. Now I understand there's going to be an update of this report, and I think it's grown to about $60 million a year. So the good news is that it's growing, but it's still a relatively small number. This MPA-focused funding is further distributed across the need to establish new areas and to stand up the management and implementation of existing areas. So here I've put together a completely non-exhaustive table of some of the general topic areas, but it does give you an illustrative idea of where some of the largest funders and NGOs are focused. Of course, there are so many more, have to acknowledge at the regional, national, and community level funding this important work for, and I hesitated to show this because I'm going to inevitably miss somebody, but I think it is helpful to have an illustrative table of where funders and NGOs are focused. So the demands on these limited resources can often lead to a lot of competition, and there's been a lot of conversation today already about this challenge. So how is the funder and NGO community responding? We're seeing a glowing recognition that we need more collaborative action. In order to achieve our goals, whether they're within a site or the 30 by 30 targets or another target, we have to work together to ensure that we are making the most of these limited resources and not having things work against each other. And as the private, philanthropic, and NGO community get better aligned, they're also looking at how private and public funding can work together, how that private dollars, like Noah was talking about, use the early seed capital to leverage big public dollars and even government support. Of course, this is way easier said than done. Private foundations, public funders, and NGOs have different and often overlapping objectives, interests, and their own constraints. So right now, the sector is really looking at developing new models to demonstrate how we can collaboratively engage with managers like you, governments, communities to achieve our aligned and shared objectives. So like this community of practice that's gathered here today, we are seeing formal and informal groups coming together across the NGO and funder space, and relationships are happening informally, but also formally in some exciting ways. The Blue Nature Alliance is one recent example of this coming together. The Campaign for Nature, backed by the Weiss Foundation, the Blue Action Fund coming from governments in Europe, the Blue Prosperity Coalition. These are just 4 recent examples, and obviously I don't have time to go into any of them today, but if they are new to you, I encourage you to look them up online and learn more about them. There are a few additional questions I want to note beyond collaboration that we are seeing this sector wrestle with that bear mentioning. One is, how do we create different models of engaging with sites that catalyze both new or expanded protection and stand up those already in place? Many of the NGO and funder community are laser focused on that 30 by 30 target. So making sure that we are meeting those goals while balancing the need for management is something that the entire community needs to discuss. The funding community in particular is thinking about how can we more thoughtfully engage with Indigenous-led communities and initiatives. Thinking about how traditional philanthropy and grant-making approaches may not apply. And of course, how can we take advantage of the increased focus of funding available for climate action, and not just adaptation, but there's a lot of questions around the mitigation potential of these protected areas. We all know the science isn't there, but everybody's asking the questions, and that is worth noting for you all here. So that is my quick. I tried to stay close to 5 minutes, Naya. And so some of the data I shared with you today are pulled really from 2 sources. Again, you can dig into it yourself. A website called fundingtheocean.org. Have a wonderful resource map where you can really start to dig in and break down who is funding which NGOs and where in the world when it comes to ocean conservation. And then a report called Our Shared Seas. And I understand Leah may be on the call representing CEA Consulting, who puts out this report. I hope I did okay, Leah. But the report is going to be updated soon, and it's going to really analyze the last decade of funding in the ocean conservation space. So I encourage you all to look out for that and to read it and learn more about this space. I've also put my email on the screen, so if I can be of help, please reach out with questions, comments. I really would love to hear from you. So thank you so much. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Naya.
Great, thank you, Ashley, so much. I was really looking forward to your presentation. I know it's about all the money stuff, which, you know, I'm the creative one, but it's still so interesting. It's such a vital component of ensuring, again, like Noah said, that we make progress, not necessarily that perfect or success, but that funding conversation is so important. Our next speaker is going to talk about education and outreach, kind of with, especially with a highlight on remote areas. And so I'm so pleased to bring on my friend and colleague, Andy Collins. He works for NOAA ONMS Papahana Mokuakea. He's the where he is the education coordinator. So thank you so much for joining us today, Andy. I will give the screen to you.
Great, mahalo Naya. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me well. So aloha, kia ora, talofa, good day, mate, buenos dias. My name's Andy Collins. I'm the education coordinator for Papahanaumokuakea, the National Monument, and I've been working for NOAA and Papahanaumokuakea for over 20 years now, and have had the privilege to be a part of its development, education, and genealogy. Now, Papahanaumokuakea is, as many of you know, the remotest part of the most isolated island archipelago on Earth, the Hawaiian archipelago. So we're several thousand miles from any continental landmass and far removed from most population centers. So this isolation has been both a blessing in terms of protection from human impacts and also a major challenge in terms of connecting people to this place and getting them to care. So we're a large site and one of the largest protected areas on Earth. We cover 1.5 million square kilometers or 582,000 square miles. No one lives in this vast marine wilderness, and those that do work there only as visitors. It's home to 14 million seabirds and several thousand marine species, many found nowhere else on Earth. We're a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a sacred site to Native Hawaiians, a place where spirits return after death and where Hawaiian chiefs would travel to construct ceremonial sites and enhance their mana or ruling power. It is a place of deities. And today it is a guiding light in the expansion of large-scale marine protection, forging a path through an uncertain future. As many of you here are aware, we have a great challenge in connecting terrestrial-minded species to marine concerns. Certainly Hawaiians and oceanic people the world over understand the importance of the ocean, but for many it's an afterthought. And the beautiful, pristine surface is all they see. And often from that perspective, everything looks spectacular. But those gathered here today know this is far from the truth. Through our education and outreach programs, we attempt to delve deeper into the complexity of our watery world. And where we can, show people firsthand what's going on and why they should care. And when we cannot, we connect them virtually through teaching, outreach programs, Google Earth, Street View, virtual reality experiences, and storytelling. However, I cannot stress enough the importance, despite the cost and complexity, of facilitating access for community change leaders to your sites. These are your advocates and your army, and have demonstrated time and time again their value as we experience their value as with the community-driven campaign, as we experienced with the community-driven campaign to expand Papahanaumokuakea in 2016. Many of the leaders of this effort were people that we had facilitated access to the monument for. And certainly teachers, such as you see in this picture here, we facilitated several teacher expeditions to the monument, helped to connect with our next generation of leaders. We also produce curriculum and conduct structured classes for school groups. While outreach, media, and social media address your short-term awareness and engagement needs, for the long term, we need an ocean literate public. And this is only achieved through formal and informal education, like we do through these kinds of larger scale education curricula that we develop. But last but not least, it's critical to have inspiring imagery for your site. This is the best way to connect and inspire a broad audience, and should include the whole range of art, photography, videography, facilitating the production of movies, which is one of the biggest ways that people connect to nature these days. Music, like this song you see, one of the artists in Hawaii produced this really fun and cool song about Papahanaumokuakea that's really catchy. Painting, hula, keep your mind open and diverse, but definitely focus on imagery to build up passion for your site. It's my firm opinion that Papahanaumokuakea would not be where we are today without all the amazing imagery we have helped to collect over the years. It builds our brand and provides a main line to the heart. And speaking of the heart, I'd like to leave you with this thought. We often struggle with trying to have all the best information before making decisions, gather all the science and the best research to back our management and designation actions. But the truth, especially with marine conservation, is that it's not all there and it's not all conclusive. And if this pandemic has taught us one thing, sorry, my thing just jumped there. And if this pandemic has taught us one thing, is that you can have the best science and the world and still not convince enough people to save themselves. At least that's one of my takeaways. So I say that collect as much data and research as you can and then go for the heart. It's harder to argue against the desire to have coral reefs left for our children or large fish left to see. Gather all the evidence you can and then build a compelling story and emotion-driven campaign. The designation of the monument of Papahanaumokuakea was not completed due solely to science, but through connection to place, story, and emotion. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I look forward to any questions.
Awesome, Andy. Thank you so much. So again, right, hold your questions. We'll have the Q&A at the end. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball to my team here. So we have Nathan and John Day as the last two presenters. And it looks like both of those were going to need to be pre-recorded. There's a possibility, I'm communicating with Nathan, that he might jump on and present on human dimensions. We're not sure. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to present kind of by proxy for John Day. He recorded a PowerPoint with his audio. I'm going to play that, and then we will see where we're at at that point. And then Rebecca might actually come on to present on human dimensions. And who knows, Nathan may pop up. So we're going to play around with this. So team, if you guys can allow me, I'm going to share my screen.
Hi there, my name's John Day, talking to you from James Cook University, Queensland, Australia. I'm sorry I can't join you at the summit, but today I want to talk to you about a successful policy reform in the Great Barrier Reef, Australia, and the multiple enabling factors that led to that success. Most of you will know about the zoning of the Great Barrier Reef, but some of you won't be aware of the comprehensive policy process we went through to get that outcome. It was a 5-year policy process that was built upon a whole range of enabling factors. Just quickly to remind you, the Great Barrier Reef is a very large area. It's not the largest of our large-scale MPAs, but it is about the size of many countries, Italy or Japan. The process we went through to develop the zoning plan was quite comprehensive over 5 years. It started off with a recognition that the existing zoning that was in place since the 80s was not protecting the biodiversity. The process involved science at the start, involved in the community in 2 formal phases, a draft plan and a final plan, before the new zoning plan came into effect in 2004. If you want more information, the thesis that's outlined in the bottom right-hand corner gives more information about the whole process. There were 4 interrelated factors that contributed to the success of the overall zoning. The first was the sound underpinning of science, but so important was effective public engagement, a lattice of leadership and followership, and the politics of the process. There were also other factors like sound institutional support, passion, trust and luck, but the 4 factors shown in bold were the key factors for the success. So what were some of the lessons about scientific underpinning? Science really did provide a fundamental part of the process, but the outcome was much more than just about science. Politics helps determine the direction of the step, but science helps the eyes to focus. In the process, we used the best available science, and they improved during the planning. But we also used analytical tools like MarkSAM, but I stress they did not provide the answer. If you want more information about this, Chapter 3 in my thesis talks all about the scientific underpinning. So what were some of the lessons about public engagement? Engagement was essential and an integral part of the planning. There was a need to engage all stakeholders and rights holders throughout the entire planning process. We recognised there were differing community issues along the coast, which needed a wide range of communication materials to be developed and then applied. We also recognised that public meetings were largely ineffectual. It was far more effective to engage the community in small, direct engagement sessions. We also learnt it's important not to ignore the stakeholders who choose to remain silent. How we did these things are articulated in the paper set out at the bottom of the page. These 2 maps show the importance of public engagement and the significance of the public submissions received during the 2 phases of public engagement. So you can see between the first map, the draft plan, and the second, the extensive changes that occurred. And again, it was the submissions that led to many of those changes. So what were some of the lessons about leadership? We had a very effective CEO, and that was essential, but no leader within a large-scale marine protected area has all the necessary skills in dealing with the range of issues required. What we had was a cohesive leadership team. This was the key. And so the term lattice leadership was more the reality. There were many leaders woven, and at different times, different skills, leadership skills occurred. So leadership occurred at many levels, but all were interacting effectively together. It's important to recognise that leadership occurs at many different scales and places. So there was political leadership, agency leadership, and leadership even within the sectors. Again, for more information, chapter 4 in the thesis. Some lessons about politics. Many agency staff overlook the critical role of politics when making policy. But as this quote says, policy making of any kind is highly political. It's important when you're talking to politicians to not raise false expectations of a win-win. Compromises are really more likely than win-win outcomes. It's also important to recognise that political priorities, particularly timeframes, are rarely the same as your MPA priorities. You need to understand about political windows when politicians want things to happen and quickly, so we call those political windows. And it's important to recognise that political leadership was fundamental to get the final approval of the plan. Again, more information in chapter 6 of the thesis. This matrix shows the interrelationship between the 4 key factors and the outcome. Across the top, we have the 4 factors, and down the left-hand side, we can see the level of influence of the same factors on each of the 4 key factors. For example, if we think about politics on the right-hand side here, you can see through the green colour, which indicates a major influence, that science, leadership and public engagement all had a major level of influence on the final political outcome. But in contrast, if we look at what level politics themselves played, politics had little or no influence on the science or on the public engagement, though it did influence the leadership. So it was a complex interaction between all 4 key factors. I haven't got time to run through the rest of the details. If you want more information, please contact me at the email shown below. Thank you.
Sorry if the audio wasn't great. It was playing better before, but we really wanted John Day to speak to the enabling conditions. That was his recent PhD thesis. So he provided the link there. We will provide it in the chat again, if not today, tomorrow. But in essence, right, as you've seen, science is important, but it's played out and needs to be used in a really different way for it to be successful, I think, than how we have been thinking about it. Our next Ignite speaker is a dear colleague, Nathan Bennett, who's been working in the human dimensions field in the marine context, as well as specifically the large scale marine context for quite a number of years. We're excited to have his presentation. If you look in your agenda, you'll be able to click on his bio to learn more. But I think his presentation will give you a really great snapshot, both of his work as well as, you know, the purpose of human dimensions within marine conservation. So without further ado, Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Naya. So I just want to talk really briefly about the human dimensions of large-scale marine conservation. And like many things, success in marine conservation is a journey and not a destination. This is certainly true where the human dimensions of marine conservation are concerned. We've come a long way, but we still have a lot to learn. In the early days of large-scale marine conservation, shown by this map, which is already some years old, advocacy and establishment of large-scale marine protected areas was largely driven by a concern for the ecological status of the oceans, and decisions were mostly made with ecological information from the natural scientists. However, large-scale marine protected area scholars, practitioners, managers, and advocates alike very quickly realized that there was a need to better account for the human dimensions. And human dimensions, just to remind us, is a broad term. It loosely refers to the set of social, economic, cultural, political, and institutional considerations related to conservation or resource management. Insights related to the human dimensions can produce, our research related to human dimensions can produce practical insights and recommendations for managers and policymakers that can be applied to governance, design, and ongoing management of large-scale marine protected areas. A key moment in the conversation related to the human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas occurred in 2016. A group of marine conservation practitioners and human dimensions scholars, led by Patrick Christie from the University of Washington and Alani Wilhelm from Conservation International, collaboratively organized a think tank on the human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas in Honolulu. The event involved more than 125 participants, including managers, funders, academic practitioners, government representatives, and industry representatives from all around the world. And through facilitated dialogues and group discussions, we pursued a number of different objectives. Our objectives were to evaluate existing knowledge on the human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas, to identify best management practices, to draft a practical shared human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas research agenda, and then to develop and launch a community of practice. And so just as a summary of the main outcomes that we produced from the Human Dimensions think tank, it included 3 products. And so first was this shared research agenda, which was published by Patrick Christie et al. In 2017. And that laid out this broad and strategic research agenda related to all different sorts of topics that could be explored in the context of large-scale marine conservation. It also led to a special issue in coastal management on large-scale marine protected areas and the human dimensions. And since then, numerous other publications have come out related to the human dimensions of large-scale marine protected areas. The second main outcome of the Human Dimensions think tank was a set of best management practices. And these were published in a document under the Human Dimensions think tank. And it kind of included a set of high-level guidance for integration of the human dimensions into large-scale marine protected areas. And some of that guidance, I believe, also found its way into the IUCN guidelines for the management of large-scale marine protected areas. And then finally, there was the intention of creating a much broader community of practice. And I do think that that community of practice related to the human dimensions of large-scale marine conservation does live on in various ways through a number of different individuals and initiatives. However, to really have a coherent community of practice related to the human dimensions, we found it a bit challenging to fund that. Of course, a key outcome of this initiative was identification of the need to tailor the design and implementation of large-scale marine protected areas to different social, cultural, and governance and historical contexts. And the types of human dimension topics that were identified that need to be taken into account in design and management include topics such as the following: stakeholder engagement, rights, tenure, and access, transparency and communications, free, prior, and informed consent, Indigenous and human rights, social equity, governance, human well-being and socioeconomic impacts, sustainable livelihoods, integrative planning and management, culture and traditional knowledge, collaborative management processes, and Indigenous and community leadership in conservations. And in conservation. And of course, there's many lessons that can be gained from different locales where large-scale marine protected areas already exist of how these ideas can be applied in practice. So lessons can be drawn, for example, from the Great Barrier Reef in Australia on how to engage and get feedback from stakeholders. We can also draw lessons from Papanemohokuakea National Marine Monument in Hawaii or Marae Moana in Cook Islands on how cultural values and protocols can be incorporated into the visions for large-scale marine protected areas. Finally, lessons can be drawn from newer large-scale marine protected areas in Canada regarding how to create collaborative governance arrangements between Indigenous communities and national governments. And these are just a few examples among many. But I think there's a really big need to document and share these case studies, the lessons learned and the best practices that we could be amassing over time. One example of developing a set of best practices is shown in a recent paper by a group of us, marine conservation thinkers and doers, who brought together some of the lessons and ideas on how social equity might be taken into account in marine conservation. In our paper on advancing social equity in and through marine conservation, we argue that there is a need to take into account 6 aspects of equity: recognition, procedures, distribution, management, the environment, and the context. We account for recognition through acknowledging and respecting the dignity of diverse peoples. We account for procedures through fostering participation and good governance. We account for distribution through maximizing benefits and minimizing burdens for local populations. We argue that we account for management through championing and supporting local involvement, as well as leadership in management. We account for the environment through ensuring efficacy of conservation actions and adequacy of management to provide benefits to both nature and people. And finally, we account for the context through understanding the structural barriers to inequity, or to equity and in conservation, and also the institutional roots of inequity in conservation itself. I want to just kind of come back to this question of where to next with the human dimensions of large-scale marine conservation. And I think, you know, there's a few things that we need to do. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the first thing that we really need to do as we move ahead is we need to document case studies and continue to share those lessons learned around best practices for incorporating all manner of human dimensions into practice. The second is that there's many individuals in organizations, from government to non-governmental organizations to philanthropic organizations, who don't really have the knowledge or the capacity on how to incorporate human dimensions into their thinking and into their projects and into their practices. And so the second area that we need to improve on is we need to continue to build capacity in the human dimensions. And then third, you know, the thing that kind of fell to the wayside after the Human Dimensions think tank was to forge this community of practice around the human dimensions of large-scale marine conservation. And I think that we need to continue to forge that community of practice through bringing groups and individuals together to continue to share those lessons and to advance policy and practice of the human dimensions in large-scale marine conservation. That's all from me. I look forward to hearing from you. Feel free to reach out and contact me via the email at the bottom of the slide.
Rebecca, do you want to message me if you are still willing to come and present about human dimensions?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Great, awesome. So I'm going to close mine, and then team, if you can spotlight Rebecca and allow her to share.
So this is a bit on the fly, and this was actually a presentation that I gave at the World Conservation Congress, and I don't even remember what year it was, but a number of years ago, to introduce folks to the human dimensions of LSMPAs. So it's certainly appropriate for this purpose. So let's just jump in. The term human dimensions, what do we mean by that? So the term actually emerged largely from the wildlife and land management traditions in the United States and later the global environmental change community. And initially, the focus was largely on research that provided practical insights and recommendations for managers and policymakers. Human dimensions today has become a much broader term, very broadly applied, and it loosely refers to the set of social, economic, cultural, political, and institutional considerations related to conservation or resource management. You can think of these as the people-oriented factors. And from a practical perspective, anyone involved in natural resource conservation or management deals with human dimensions as an integral part of your work. And so the moment a discussion begins about whether, how, and where to designate a large-scale MPA, the realm of human dimensions has been entered. And so From a scientific perspective, scholars across many social science disciplines, including anthropology, geography, political science, sociology, economics, legal studies, psychology, etc., the list goes on, we all contribute to a large and wide body of research on the human dimensions of natural resources. But specifically in marine protected areas, there's also a long history of research and experience with smaller coastal MPAs that has illuminated the importance of key human dimensions issues that can greatly influence the outcomes of MPAs. And these include, just to name a few, the need to tailor the design and implementation of MPAs to the social, cultural, and historical context, in addition to the biological and physical contexts in which they are located. Secondly, the importance of minimizing negative social and economic impacts and maximizing positive impacts to improve the likelihood of social acceptance and political will. And third, the importance of employing and using transparent, equitable, and participatory planning processes. Again, these improve the likelihood that the MPA will be perceived as legitimate and perceived as equitable and just, and increase the likelihood of success. And so it's now widely understood that planning, implementing, and managing smaller coastal MPAs requires that equal attention be paid to biological and oceanographic issues and these human dimensions issues. Most of what we know about the human dimensions of MPAs has come from research and experience with smaller MPAs that are closer to shore and closer to populated urban centers. In 2008, the average size of MPAs was 544 square kilometers. Large-scale MPAs are more than 200 times that size. And so in part, because of their extensive size, many LSMPAs are remote. They encompass offshore and open ocean areas. And this unique geography means that their human dimensions, although equally important, might actually be a bit different from those in smaller MPAs in a number of ways. And I'm going to talk about those distinctions. The first distinction is a conceptual one, the way we think about them. So the geographic remoteness of LSMPAs sometimes can contribute to a conceptual distinction where LSMPAs are sometimes imagined or represented as unpeopled wilderness areas, though certainly not always. Some have struggled to see the importance of these people-oriented factors, right? The human dimension factors for spaces where there are no people, quote unquote. Although I think that this conceptualization is changing in part due to the work of you all and social scientists who are starting to study these issues. I would argue that this conceptual distinction has meant that human dimensions consideration have not been mainstreamed for LSMPAs the way that they have for smaller coastal MPAs. Of course, these human dimensions issues are not irrelevant though, or non-existent. We think they're simply different. So the extension of LSMPAs into deeper waters and more remote locations means that their meaning and value for diverse groups is maybe not as visible or as easily understood. And it might not be based on physical use or presence. So trips to remote LSMPAs like the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument, and certainly trips to Papahanaumokuakea, we know they may be infrequent and really expensive, but these spaces and the ability to make those trips are of immense cultural value to local residents, okay? Their size and remoteness also, and here is King Sam, also pose unprecedented governance challenges. One of these is the question of who should be part of LSMPA decision-making and how to effectively engage potentially large numbers of geographically dispersed stakeholders. And another issue is how to adequately monitor and enforce such large and remote spaces. We see these challenges that we've identified as human dimensions challenges certainly coming up in the survey as ongoing challenges. Relative to conventional MPAs, we think the politics of LSMPAs tend to be higher profile and higher level. They intersect with national, bilateral, and global politics, policies, and agendas in ways that smaller coastal MPAs simply don't. Smaller coastal MPAs don't typically attract the attention of world leaders like President Tommy Remengesau or Senator John McCain. And finally, large-scale MPAs differ from smaller MPAs in the type, the scope, and the reach of their social, political, cultural, and economic outcomes. Instead of impacting or only impacting particular communities, the outcomes of LSMPAs can affect entire nations and even relationships between countries. And so this is just an introduction to what we mean by human dimensions issues and how they might be different in large-scale MPAs. A growing number of social scientists, managers, NGOs, and donors are recognizing the unique human dimensions of LSMPAs, and we've been calling for a distinct social science research agenda on LSMPAs and management guidelines and other tools that are specifically tailored to fit the unique needs of LSMPAs have emerged, like the IUCN guidelines that John Day and Nia Lewis and others, many others actually in this meeting have produced. And so it's really great to see the growth in this field, given the unique questions, challenges, and opportunities that LSMPAs pose for the human dimensions side of things. I'll go ahead and end there. I think that was about 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for presenting on the fly. We really wanted to have a human dimensions component, so we appreciate you stepping in. What we are going to do is go ahead and in the chat, though, we will share a link to the recent paper that's Nathan et al. Produced. Just so you guys can have a sense of some of the work, but there was the code of conduct. So there's, again, lots of people on this call that have interacted not only with Rebecca, but with Nathan and Noella and Lisa around human dimensions. So thank you, really. Thank you so much. And I'll see if for the recording that we provide at the end, if I can't get with John Day, and even Nathan to add like recordings of those in for additional resources. Okay, so we're running not too bad, guys. We're only running about 10-15 minutes late. So it just means that, our Q&A, okay, there, Jonah, right into the chat, he dropped a link if you guys want to see the paper that was just released the other day that Nathan kind of spearheaded. So we're just gonna roll into a Q&A. We're just gonna bring all of our Ignite presenters back up. But as we've all been talking today, where it's really the relationship between all of these like elements, if you were to silo them in management, you can also, hearken back to the survey or other elements of the discussion as well. Okay, so we're just spotlighting there our panelists. Do you guys? So I'm going to start off. I know John's not here, but Alan, since his work was kind of looking at the correlation with like research and science and how to use that to justify a site, but this interesting relationship with politics and whether or not the science really creates support for these sites. Just what are some of your comments of science around large scale kind of out in the real world, and maybe how managers could think about using it or managing it in ways that kind of address what John is talking about, like not just collecting it, but like what do you do with it? How do you leverage that to kind of make the most for a large scale site?
Right. So a couple of things on that. First, I want to say it's all about hearts and minds, right? The first thing you need to do is inspire people to care. And I mean, through Pristine Seas, the most compelling things are the videos and all the other things that Andy talked about to get people excited about their backyard or places that they may never see, but that are theirs to manage. So I think we don't, as much as, science is great and important, need to realize where it sits in the whole picture of things. And I'm talking about more of the physical and biological sciences. And so because most of these areas are large and remote and costly to visit, the science needs to be directed towards what are the specific management questions. We'd like to know everything about everything, but we can't. And so management and public needs to focus on what are the primary issues that are facing the particular large scale site. And then so science needs to be tailored to that. And any other science that can happen helps support both bottom up and top down processes, but it can't lead the charge.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Alan. I do see a hand up for Archipelago Juan Fernandez. If you guys want to unmute, you can ask your question, or you can also put it in the chat if you'd like me to ask it for you guys.
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity of participating in this summit. We have a question. We want to see more participation of the communities. We are here representing the Juan Fernandez community, and we have not yet seen anyone from another community participating, just investigators or administrators, part of the organization. And I don't know, we are the only one, and we want to know why. We are right now, thank you, Sebastian. We are right now in a process with the government trying to reach co-management of our protected marine areas, and we need the support of everyone. These instances for us are really enlightening for us, but we need to know if they're like someone who resonates with us and have the same challenges and obstacles that we are having right now.
Thank you for your question. Mahalo. Actually, so in the chat, I see James. Aloha, James. Thank you for joining. As I'm looking at the list, there definitely are a lot of people that, work either with NGOs or managers, but there are some community members. I don't know if anyone, James, I'm reading your comment. I don't know if you want to comment. Kalani, who's online as well, that represents Papahanaumokuakea. He is, I think, many times some of the managers feel they are both community and managers. And Papahanaumokuakea and the Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group has had a lot to do with engaging community. But I don't know if, James, you wanted to come on, or even Juliana, to make a short comment on behalf of community.
Aloha, Naya. This is Kalani. I can make a brief comment and follow up to what you shared. And mahalo for welcoming my children in the background as well. But I just wanted to point out that my previous position as the Native Hawaiian Program Specialist was a position that was advocated by our community. They saw that with the increasing acknowledgement of Native Hawaiians and the inclusion of their culture, that we needed to have a dedicated position in the agencies to implement many of the strategies that they were seeking, their interests, their needs. And so it was a position that was conceived as a cultural advisor to the agencies, as well as a liaison between agencies and the community members. And like you said, many of us are now kind of in between, community members, but also working as public servants within agencies or NGOs. And I think that's also part of the progression that we've talked about, the succession planning that many of Papahanaumokuakea had envisioned 20 years ago. I'm a beneficiary of their programs. I was an intern, and now I'm a manager. And I think that's a beautiful story to be able to tell and to be a part of. And that's, I think, where, like Andy was saying, the hearts and minds, and like Alan was saying, the hearts and minds have come together to envision what this could be for our communities, that, co-management is not discreetly just managers and communities on either side of the fence or the building, but now we are actively at the table and representing not just our communities, but all that within. And so community, I think, has also been redefined in many, many ways. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Kalani. I would definitely echo that sentiment. As a Native Hawaiian and my participation in the office at Papahanaumokuakea as well as out in the community. And then now that I don't formally work there anymore, even though I'm coordinating Big Ocean, Big Ocean is an independent entity. At the same time, I wear also a hat, right, as a Native Hawaiian in terms of what I'm there to help amplify. And I really appreciate your comment, Kalani, that you were in internships and like worked your way through. And so I think there is a big commitment here in Hawaii to have the Indigenous voice, the Native Hawaiian voice within management, as well as externally at all levels. And it definitely is a journey. I don't think we have anyone here from OHA, but the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is actually a separate state entity, like working on behalf of Native Hawaiians, that it has over time become an actual co-trustee there at the monument. So it is a progression. I don't know if anyone else would like to say something specifically to community, but I feel like having defined groups, whether that's formal or not, be able to engage with management and ensure that there are also community members within management, if that's possible, or having internships, similar things are really important. Okay, you guys, you can, again, continue to put questions in the chat. I'm gonna aim, is there one?
Looks like Jackie's
got a question.
Jackie, please.
Sorry. Yeah, just in response to that comment, I think I feel, as a Indigenous Cook Islander and a member of several tribes within the island and working in the community and also managing the large marine protected area, that these roles are all overlapping and I wear several hats. And I think that it's just really well, we do have the same. I think you'll find if you talk with us over a longer period of time, we have the same issues that you have, a lot of the same issues, and so you'll probably find that useful participating over time with the network that our issues are very much similar.
Thank you, Jackie, for that. I'm also reading in the chat. We have, it's become very active here. While I'm looking at those, because there is a component and a question about equity and sometimes, social engagement coming much too late in the process. Let's kind of circle back, but I would like to connect, Ashley and Noah and funding and NGOs. Private funding is very different than public funding. And it's also like the idea of getting funding or a grant is also different than building a budget, right, for a site. I don't know if either of you, though, have a little bit to say about how those, interact. Is it helpful to have an actual staff member or group that's looking specifically like at granting, or that is really gets their hands dirty and understanding, I know you don't like to use business planning, Noel, but like that element of it, like what do you guys feel maybe are the capacities, or maybe even how to balance those two elements? Is there's one that you think is kind of low-hanging fruit that you would go after, one before the other?
I would just say very quickly for this community, a lot of the private funders that I was talking about today don't fund governments and won't fund government positions. Some of them will, most of them won't. So you really need to access that funding, need to work through NGO partners. So having those relationships be strong can be very, very important to make sure that you can access that funding, which is less of a fundraising capacity and much more just that relationship building and from you directly or your others on your team. I'd say on the public funding space, that's where your relationships with the governments can really be very, very important, and understanding who your secretariats for the various funding groups are, from the GEF and the GCF and the, just the other entities often has representatives in each country, and their priorities often get set by the national government.
So it's all interconnected. But going after that, you can do in partnership with your government, with the rest of your government and NGOs, go after the public dollars. That is highly technical in terms of the writing that is required, the metrics, the science, and all of that. And having that kind of capacity can be really valuable because those can be really big dollars over long periods of time. Noah, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess I would just, I mean, I think well said, Ashley. I would just differentiate public money from the international, multilateral, bilateral funds and local public government budgets, which also is a critical resource. And go back to the idea of developing partnerships as you work with, private philanthropic funders, as you reach out to them to cultivate these relationships. And, we talk about, managing upwards, for instance, right? There is a part of this that is helping the potential funders to develop their own agenda, right? And sort of inserting yourself into their agenda over time. And then, this is an iterative process. So as I tried to, state earlier, then going back to your budgets and sort of being able to adjust them in line with expectations for, what you think you might be able to generate from these different sort of funding sectors, from your partners in the private philanthropic sector, from your partners in the local government, from your, from partnerships with, perhaps folks that may be interested or able to go after larger multilateral grants and things like that. So it really is an iterative process. Of course, the more human capacity you have, the better off you are, and all of these things become very specialized. But there are approaches to simplify these, and private philanthropic donors, those are often the kind of easiest dollars to get in a way, and a good place to start.
I appreciate that. Thank you. The chat is really interesting. We're definitely going to save it. Like I said, we will come back and work to provide additional information after, but there seems to be where there's a crossover is, I think, this relationship between like political windows and information, and the need is in many ways to like build relationships over time, but also be able to be flexible enough to act. Like if there's a change in administration, you need to act right away. So I guess there's a few of you that I'd like to ask questions on, but Andy, what role does, a lot of people think of education and outreach as we're going to make a pamphlet or we're going to create a website. Whereas, in the monument, there was strategic, use of images and messaging and understanding when you were going to need to get the right messages out. I would say this component of engaging community and indigenous stakeholders as well. It's the kind of messaging. I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to throw into this pot of political windows and timing and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, just kind of leveraging off of Patrick's great comment in the chat. From my perspective, being involved from the beginning, I can say that a lot of the folks that were involved early on that are Native Hawaiians were very conflicted with the process of being involved in the government process, and there's a lot of lack of trust with the government. And our leadership, from Aulani to Naya to Moani, all of them had challenges with that. But that was, in a lot of ways, the turning point that allowed us to have a Native Hawaiian cultural working group to, if somebody's applying for a permit, a Native Hawaiian group's applying for a permit to access Papahana Mokuakea for ceremonial purposes or other things. Does the government really have the expertise of the ability to evaluate that permit? No. A community-based cultural working group can evaluate that from a community perspective, because they perhaps know these people or know somebody who knows somebody who knows those people, and are they legitimate? Are they, all those kinds of things. So just related to your question, I do think that in getting those people up there and helping to facilitate that and prioritize that, change the whole dynamic within the community, even down to the level of having imagery and things that represent those people in the monument, where you have people coming up to see somebody like them that went to Roosevelt High School and, you know, in Hawaii. I mean, it's very important where you went to high school here. You know, it's like seeing somebody that looks like them, that goes up there, that has something, the same mind or heart, changed the buy-in tremendously in terms of the process and other things. So we definitely strategically help to facilitate that and continue to do so. In fact, a couple of days ago, another culturally focused research team went up, it just left for Papahanaumokuakea, and they continue to do that. So, and, you know, taking those images and utilize, it was interesting watching the presentations because I was like, that one's ours, that one's ours, that one's ours. It was like, you know, I mean, I think you could see even from this crew of international folks that, you know, our imagery and things like that we've collected have gotten out there for people to illustrate their points. And that's what we wanted. You know, we didn't want ownership or buy-in or copyright or anything like that. In fact, everything we've gone towards is to limit copyright and to limit, to make things public domain for that we collect and things like that so that people can share it and reutilize it to grow large scale marine protected areas and protected areas. And that's a strategic, often challenging decision, because if you've ever been in the media game, the whole thing about the media game is control of those imagery and resources. And you have to be strategic about how you do that when you facilitate people to access that are image, you know, video and imagery collection people so that you can utilize it in that way. So I've been involved in a lot of those discussions and contracts and writing of those things over the years, and it's a challenge. And regarding political windows, I mean, you know, just our discussion in our group earlier with the gentleman from Australia, we've both experienced the whiplash of political windows and the importance of being able to move fast when the opportunity is there and being able to hide when the opportunity isn't. And, you know, I was thinking about that in terms of when, you know, we've been challenged as a large scale site. We've been told to like tone it back. Don't say how big you are at this time. It's not a good thing to be a target. And, you know, and other times we've been like, yeah, we're huge and we're important. And so it's, you know, you have to be dexterous. You have to be able to dance with the politics. And I think we've all been exposed to that in all our different sites. So yeah, that's critical.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, we got Solomon Enos up to Papahanaumokuakea in addition to actual like cultural accesses. But even instead of photography, we worked to get someone who was an artist and a painter to actually go up. So I think that there's a lot of interesting things you can do with imagery. To go back to equity and management, you know, Noah, you were saying part of the funding might be through partners that you could get for some of the early design or some of those other components that really might even have to happen before a site is established. And I feel that ties into, you know, James's comment that, you know, community engagement is often too little too late. And then, you know, Rebecca with Human Dimensions, is there anything that you kind of wanted to say about that importance of really from the earliest stages engaging community and creating a way that there can be a dialogue between a variety of stakeholders, and especially if they are rights holders. And I'm sure funding very often could be an issue to like a robust process in those early days.
Yeah, I would love to say something about that. These are such important and excellent questions. You know, in our research on the human dimensions of large-scale MPAs and the sites that we were looking at, we often found the most conflict at the designation of the site surrounded the engagement of local and indigenous communities in the decision-making process. That is where we found the conflict in the designation. And that is why I'm so interested to see the survey findings that in 8 of the 11 sites, respondents said community members are somewhat or very involved in ongoing decision-making, even though they don't have formal decision-making roles. And so I think that's a fascinating finding, and I'd be really curious for this community to share how that is, right? How are community members being engaged? What does that look like for them to be involved in ongoing decision making, even when they don't have formal roles, because maybe this contributes to the decreasing social conflict that we're seeing across many sites. And I think this is relevant to the question that came from the folks in from the Juan Fernandez community, right? Like, how do we get involved? This is a question and an issue that can help inform their question as well. So just a couple of thoughts on that point.
Thank you. Looking at the chat again, Alan, is there, especially for really remote sites, I mean, the idea of citizen science is, it's not like it's happening right there. And I guess it depends, right? If it's a Marae Moana and it's the full EEZ, and there might be science that maybe community is doing, but is in your perspective, is it kind of like science partnerships so that community can kind of gain that scientific information from researchers such as yourself, or is it kind of the citizen science and getting people to do science? Is what kind of component or relationship is it in providing community with some of the information that they really need, I guess, to understand how to move forward, how to make certain priorities based off of their values?
Right. It's place dependent, obviously, because some of these places are so remote that you can't get to them. I mean, what we have tried to do is make space available on expeditions. When we went to Motumotuhiva, we had, Rapa Nui person there. When we work in places like Niue or Palau, we work with the local fishing community, working on some shark depredation work right now. So there's different ways to engage. Oftentimes, another thing is to give back. A lot of people just parachute in, do their thing, and then bail. And so going back to a place, we usually, after an expedition, we try to go back, we screen our film, we present the scientific findings from the expedition, we try to share and listen as well. And a lot of the additional science that we've done after the first science has been a result of inquiries from the communities, things that, what's important to them. Like I said, the shark depredation work we're doing right now in Niue and Palau are an example of that. But it's challenging, but I think moving forward, we've also recognized is trying to identify potential young leaders who could be proponents and, you could nurture into the future. So identifying people, young conservation leaders, engage in expeditions, or even, given tools and worked with after the fact. Because, a lot of times heads of states get up on the world stage and make the proclamation that they're going to protect this area, and then they declare victory and go home. And then we all know that that's where the hard work starts. So it's from the human dimensions, the governance, the policy, the financing, the science, that's where it all starts. And so you just need to have a long-term view. So from the science perspective, yeah, it's just going to be particular to that place. But I think engagement and listening and trying to kind of nurture people is an approach.
Yeah, from the chat, I think crossing over with, because we've been talking about fully and highly protected sites is, I think, providing really the most benefit. But even in fully and highly protected, like Papahanaumokuakea, you can still have cultural access, trying to define no take as being 100% no take, or, communities from a cultural perspective being able to come in. With that said, I guess I am thinking though of the funding space, and Ashley and Noah, not to put you on the spot, and actually, no, I see your hand, Noah, but is there a component of also like MPA or funding that's driven by, what the gift or the funder sees as important, or their view, like an MPA, it must be no take, or it has to have these kind of parameters? And like, do you feel the parameters in the funding space are in line with like where we're going with this social science and human dimensions? Are they keeping track where the funders are seeing these different kinds of definitions of MPA and what people want to see? Are they tracking along with one another? And Noah, you had your hand up, so I'm not sure if what I asked had anything to do with what you wanted to talk about.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I think it's a similar conversation. I think the question earlier about, when different funders come in and what their proper role is. So I guess, the general observation that from my perspective is that, no, the funding does not track to the needs as well. And that's not necessarily a comment just on the funders, but also a comment on where the space is more generally. And I would add to the list, obviously it's context dependent, but I would add to the list things like capacity development, institutional development and strengthening. These are critical things that, when funding goes into, MPA development or management, I mean, you really need to siphon off a very significant chunk of those funds for things like capacity development and institutional development, stakeholder engagement, and some of these the human dimensions, some of the other issues that we're talking about here. And that's, and I would argue that those percentages are upwards of like even shares. So when we have, a set number of dollars set aside for conservation, I would argue that, maybe half of that or more needs to be going to these issues of, otherwise, implementation on the ground is sort of somewhat compromised from the start. And so I think, we don't have very strong sort of, objective information on how much money should go to these things, the percentage of funding that should be allocated to these things. But I do wish that we would recognize the importance and the scale of the financing that needs to go to this. And I'll just really close quickly by saying that there are funders that are interested in these different things. And one of the unfortunate roles of practitioners and managers is to balance and bring together this portfolio of funding to suit the needs. And at the same time, unfortunately, you do have to tailor things on the ground sometimes to suit funder demands. A lot of us have done that, but it's sort of this mix and match balancing portfolio approach that I think a lot of folks are familiar with. Ashley, did you want to highlight
That was
anything?
really well said. No, I think one thing that's just, I put up that table and just tried to illustrate how, especially in the, sorry, I'm single parenting with 2 kids and 2 dogs today. So there's a lot of space this money needs to go to, and each of those funders have their own priorities and objectives that their principals are holding them to account for. And a lot of times, I can't tell you how often, today even, I was in a conversation with a funding organization that says, yes, I value that, and I see that it's important, and I respect that that's an objective of the site and important to the plan, but that's not what we do and what we can fund. And so I think there's a lot of recognition that all of these things are important, but they've got to meet their objectives and report to their own principles as well. And that goes from public to private across the board to governments who have to deal with their citizens and the people voting for them. And so understanding, I think, as you put together that portfolio that Noah was talking about, all of the kind of going one step deeper and not just saying, who am I targeting, but who am I targeting and what are they responsible for delivering, and having empathy for understanding what their targets are and how that can fit into your funding portfolio can, I think, position you really well. But, to your original question, I think we're seeing a lot of interest in social equity issues and the community engagement and all of that. There's just, the pie isn't big enough, whether you're talking private or public, it's not. So we got to get creative and think about balancing, like Noah was talking about.
Thank you so much. We are actually at the 1:30 point. I've really pushed us as far as we can. Scott had another great question in terms of just talking about what some of those barriers might be to like Indigenous and involvement of local people. And a lot of those things, have to do with political histories and what the status of any particular group is in a variety of situations. Pretty complex. But to be respectful of people's time and people's time zones, because I'm sure it's even late for some of you, we're going to close out today. I'm going to give you a few reminders. We're going to be back tomorrow. So I do apologize if we again, couldn't get to everybody's question. I really thank everybody for your time and attention today. I thank my presenters. I hope some of you guys come back tomorrow. Whereas today was focused around, where are we, and kind of orienting and getting a lot of data thrown at us, tomorrow is really saying, okay, well, where are we going, right? Now that we have this data and we've talked a little bit about how we feel about it, what might priorities be for sites? But we're also gonna, again, focus on the community. So it's gonna also be asking you guys, whatever role you play, NGO, a funder, a manager, a practitioner, what are those things that either, well, both, that you need or that you want to do, but then what you need to get there. So tomorrow, that's kind of where the follow-up is. And I know in-person meetings or like workshops that are all day long, we're used to getting report outs from the previous day before. And I think what we're really trying to do is also really balance and honor that we are online now, like all of the time. So there's going to be a lot of kind of summaries and outputs that we will circle back after the summit itself. One example being like the recorded versions of these summaries from all of the notes. So we just thank you guys for hanging with us. So see you guys back tomorrow. If you took notes, please email them, info@bigoceanmanagers.com. There's also even a link right in the note. If you click that email link, like for day one, it will pop up right in your email with, summit notes for day one. So again, thank you guys. Thank you to all of our presenters. I hope that you felt today was time well spent, and we will be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Hawaii Standard Time